Welcome to Listening History Sleepy. Tonight we journey to an empire so vast that the sun never set upon its borders, to a king whose name the Greeks whispered with fear and the Persians spoke with reverence, to a world where Asia and Europe met not in harmony, but in collision that would shape the course of Western civilization. This is the story of Xerxes I, great king of Persia, king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Mediterranean Sea, from the deserts of Egypt to the steppes beyond the Caspian, from snow-crowned mountains to sun-scorched plains, an empire that encompassed perhaps 4% of the world's population, that united more peoples and territories than any previous power, that seemed to its subjects to be the world itself. Everything that mattered contained within its boundaries, everything beyond being merely marginal wilderness waiting to be absorbed. The story begins not with conquest but with inheritance. Xerxes did not create the Persian Empire that was his great-grandfather Cyrus's achievement, the vision that Cyrus had when he united Medes and Persians and began the expansion that would create the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. Xerxes did not even expand the empire significantly that was primarily his father Darius's work. The campaigns that brought the Indus Valley and Thrace and parts of Central Asia under Persian control, that extended the empire's reach to its practical limits, that created the administrative systems and the infrastructure that allowed such vast territories to be governed. What Xerxes did was attempt to complete his father's unfinished business, to conquer the one significant region that remained outside Persian control, Greece, that collection of fractious city-states that had humiliated Darius at Marathon, that represented the only gap in Persian dominion over the civilized world. The invasion of Greece in 480 BCE is what Xerxes is remembered for, is the event that defines his legacy in Western historical consciousness, is the story that Herodotus told and that has been retold across 25 centuries. But the invasion was not simply military campaign, was ideological conflict, was clash between two fundamentally different visions of how humans should organize themselves politically and socially. Persia represented empire, hierarchy, divine kingship, unity imposed from above, tolerance within submission, peace through superior power. Greece represented independence, citizenship, democracy in Athens at least, diversity without unity, constant conflict between city-states that nonetheless shared language and culture and religion, freedom that included freedom to fight each other as well as freedom to resist outside domination. The conflict would be presented by later generations as struggle between East and West, between despotism and freedom, between barbarism and civilization. The characterization is propaganda more than reality. Persia was sophisticated civilization with advanced administration and relative tolerance. Greece was collection of often brutal oligarchies and democracies that practiced slavery and subordinated women and engaged in constant warfare. But the propaganda endured because the conflict's outcome shaped everything that followed. Greece remained independent, Greek culture spread through Alexander's conquests, that culture influenced Rome, Rome influenced medieval Europe, Europe eventually dominated the globe. If Xerxes had conquered Greece, if Persian Empire had absorbed the Greek city-states, the entire subsequent history of Western civilization would have been different in ways we cannot begin to imagine. But Xerxes failed. Not completely. He burned Athens, defeated the Greeks at Thermopylae, demonstrated Persian power and Greek vulnerability, but ultimately failed. His fleet was destroyed at Salamis, his army was eventually defeated at Plataea, the invasion was abandoned, Greece remained independent. The failure was not because Xerxes was incompetent or because Persians were inferior warriors. Was because empire overreached, because logistics couldn't support the massive force sent into Greece, because Greek determination to remain free proved stronger than Persian determination to subjugate them, because sometimes the defender has advantages that numbers and resources cannot overcome. The story we tell tonight is not the simple narrative of Persian villainy and Greek heroism that Western tradition has preserved. It is more nuanced examination of Xerxes as person and as king, of the empire he inherited and tried to expand, of the invasion he led and the defeat he suffered, of the legacy he left and how it has been remembered and misremembered across millennia. We will see Xerxes as son inheriting impossible expectations, as king ruling impossible vastness, as commander leading impossible invasion, as man making human decisions in circumstances that allowed no good choices, as figure caught between his father's shadow and his son's disappointment, between the empire's demands and his own limitations. We will walk through Persepolis, that ceremonial capital where Xerxes built on foundations his father laid, where the vision of universal empire was carved in stone and proclaimed in inscriptions that still survive. We will follow the invasion route from Asia to Europe, across the Hellespont that Xerxes bridged with boats, through Thrace and Macedonia into Greece. We will stand at Thermopylae where Leonidas made his desperate stand, will watch Athens burn, will witness the naval battle at Salamis where the invasion's fate was decided. We will examine the empire's administrative systems, the tolerance and diversity, the infrastructure and governance that made it function. We will contemplate the Zoroastrian religion that shaped Persian worldview, the fire temples and the cosmic dualism, the theology that saw kingship as participation in divine order. And we will sit with the uncomfortable truths. That empire brought peace and prosperity to millions even as it was built on conquest and maintained through force. That tolerance within submission is still submission. That the attempt at universal sovereignty failed, but that the dream persisted and influenced every empire that followed. That Xerxes was neither the monster Greek propaganda portrayed nor the wise philosopher-king Persian propaganda claimed, but was human ruler facing problems that exceeded human capacity to solve. Making choices that seemed necessary at the time but that history would judge harshly. The night is long, the empire is vast, the story is complex. We will not rush, will not simplify, will allow nuance and contradiction to coexist, will resist the temptation to make Xerxes into hero or villain when the truth is that he was both and neither, was person shaped by circumstances not of his choosing, was king who inherited more than any person could successfully manage, was man whose failures are more famous than his achievements but whose achievements were substantial nonetheless. The journey begins now. The shadow that fell across the world waits to be understood rather than simply remembered, to be examined rather than simply judged, to be seen in its complexity rather than reduced to simple morality tale of despotism defeated by freedom. Xerxes calls across 25 centuries not the monster, not the god-king, but the man who tried to complete his father's vision, who bridged continents and burned cities, who punished the sea and retreated from Greece, who built wonders and suffered catastrophes, who was great king and was mortal, who ruled the world and could not prevent his own assassination, who became legend and remains mystery. Come, the palace waits. The columns stand, the empire remembers. Xerxes speaks still if we will listen, if we will set aside the propaganda and the simplifications, if we will see him as he was rather than as enemies and admirers made him. The king who burned the sea, the emperor of endless horizons, the shadow that fell across the world and withdrew, leaving memory and ruins and questions that have never been fully answered. His story begins. We begin in darkness, not the absence of light, but the darkness of waiting, the silence before an empire draws breath, the moment suspended between what was and what will be. Somewhere in the palace halls of Persepolis, beneath ceilings carved with winged bulls and lotus blossoms, beneath beams of cedar brought from Lebanon and painted with colors that caught lamplight and threw it back in shades of crimson and gold and lapis blue, a young prince walks corridors his father built. Corridors that stretch toward rooms he has never entered, toward a throne he is not yet prepared to claim, toward a destiny that weighs on him like the stones that form these walls, like the empire that extends beyond these walls in every direction until it reaches the edges of the known world. This is Xerxes before he became the name that Greeks would whisper with fear and Persians would speak with reverence, before he was the king who would bridge continents with ships lashed together, before he ordered the sea whipped for its disobedience to his will, before he became the shadow that fell across the world only to withdraw, leaving half of what he attempted in ruins and the other half incomplete. He is perhaps 20 years old, perhaps 25. The sources do not agree on his age when Darius died and Xerxes inherited the throne. He is son of Darius and Atossa, grandson of Cyrus through his mother's line, prince who was not the eldest son but who was chosen as heir because of his mother's royal blood, because succession in Persia favored sons of royal mothers over older sons of non-royal wives. The choice itself tells us something. Xerxes inherited not just an empire but a system, not just territories but an ideology of divine kingship and royal blood, not just power but the burden of lineage that connected him to Cyrus the Great, to the founder, to the vision of universal empire that Cyrus had dreamed and Darius had expanded, and that Xerxes would be expected to complete or at least maintain. The weight of ancestors presses on young shoulders. In every corridor he walks, his great-grandfather Cyrus walked first. Every room he enters, his father Darius ruled from. Every inscription he reads proclaims the glory of those who came before, the conquests they achieved, the peoples they subdued, the order they imposed on chaos, the peace they brought through superior force. What does it mean to inherit an empire that stretches from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the burning sands of Egypt in the south to the snow-crowned peaks of the Caucasus in the north? The question is not rhetorical. The physical impossibility of personally ruling such vastness meant that Persian kings governed through elaborate systems, satraps who ruled provinces with considerable autonomy, royal inspectors who traveled circuits ensuring satraps remained loyal, a postal system that used relay riders to carry messages across the empire at speeds not surpassed until modern times, an administrative bureaucracy that kept records in multiple languages and coordinated taxation and military recruitment and justice across territories so diverse that they shared almost nothing except submission to the great king. But systems require maintenance, require attention, require a ruler capable of understanding their complexity and managing their operation. Did young Xerxes understand what he was inheriting? Was he prepared by his father to assume these responsibilities? Or was he thrust into position he was not ready for, forced to learn through crisis, shaped more by circumstance than by training? The historical record is silent on these personal questions, gives us only the public facts. Darius died in 486 BCE. Xerxes succeeded him. The empire continued without apparent disruption. Yet there were disruptions, were challenges that reveal something about Xerxes's situation and choices. Egypt had revolted shortly before Darius died, refused to continue submitting to Persian authority, took advantage of the king's death and the succession's uncertainty to assert independence. Xerxes's first act as great king was to march to Egypt and reimpose Persian control, to demonstrate that the new king was as capable as his father of enforcing submission, to establish that the empire's unity would be maintained despite the transition. The Egyptian campaign was successful, was completed in a single season, was demonstration that Xerxes could command armies and suppress rebellion, that he possessed the military capability essential for Persian kingship. But the campaign also revealed something about Xerxes's governing style, about how he understood his role and his relationship to subject peoples. Where Darius had allowed Egypt considerable autonomy, had respected Egyptian traditions and honored Egyptian gods, had presented himself as pharaoh and legitimate successor to native Egyptian kings, Xerxes was harsher. Reduced Egypt's autonomy, imposed more direct Persian control, appointed his brother Achaemenid as satrap with instructions to govern firmly, to prevent further rebellion through force and fear rather than through accommodation and respect for local customs. The shift was subtle but significant, suggested that Xerxes saw subject peoples differently than his father had, saw them as resources to be exploited and potential threats to be controlled rather than as diverse communities to be managed with flexibility and tolerance. The interpretation may be too harsh. Xerxes faced a different situation than Darius faced, an empire at its maximum extent, facing diminishing returns from further expansion. requiring consolidation rather than accommodation, needing to emphasize control rather than toleration because the system was becoming unwieldy, was reaching the limits of what ancient administration and communication could effectively manage. Now, the harsher approach to Egypt may have been pragmatic response to changed circumstances rather than revelation of Xerxes's character. But the change occurred, the shift happened, and it would be repeated elsewhere would become pattern in Xerxes's reign. Less flexibility than Darius had shown, less willingness to accommodate local traditions, less interest in presenting himself as legitimate successor to conquered people's own rulers, and more emphasis on universal Persian sovereignty that transcended local identities. Babylon also revolted, twice during early years of Xerxes's reign, and was suppressed both times with increasing harshness. After the second revolt, Xerxes ordered the destruction of Babylon's temples, particularly the Great Temple of Marduk, the Esagila, that had been religious and political center of Babylonian identity for millennia. The destruction was both practical, eliminating a focal point for rebellion, and symbolic, demonstrating that Babylonian gods were subordinate to Persian authority, that even the most ancient and sacred sites were not immune to great king's power, that religious tolerance had limits, and those limits were determined by political necessity. The destruction of Babylon's temples has been debated by scholars. Some argue it was not as thorough as ancient sources claim, that Xerxes destroyed or damaged the temples but did not utterly annihilate them, that later rebuilding and continued religious activity suggest the reports of complete destruction were exaggerated by Greek sources hostile to Xerxes. Others maintain that the destruction was real and was turning point, was moment when Xerxes departed from his predecessor's policies of religious tolerance, was when the empire's character began to change from accommodation to domination, from diversity preserved to uniformity imposed. We walk beside young Xerxes through palace halls, watching lamplight flicker against carved reliefs showing endless processions of tribute-bearers bringing gifts from every corner of the empire, gold from Lydia, horses from Armenia, camels from Arabia, lions from Africa. The reliefs proclaim empire's reach, demonstrate its diversity, show all the peoples of the world submitting to Persian authority while maintaining their distinctive identities, bringing what makes them unique as offering to the universal sovereign. The vision is powerful, is attractive, is seductive. Unity without uniformity, peace without conquest's total destruction, empire that contains rather than erases, power that protects rather than oppresses. But the vision requires a particular kind of ruler, requires someone capable of maintaining the balance between central authority and local autonomy, between Persian dominance and subject people's identities, between the power to destroy and the wisdom to preserve. Did Xerxes possess these qualities? Or did he inherit a system that was already unsustainable, that had reached the limits of what ancient imperial administration could manage, that required either transformation or collapse, and that he attempted to transform in ways that ultimately accelerated the empire's eventual dissolution. The question hangs unanswered in palace silence, drifts through columned halls where courtiers sleep and guards stand watching stars through windows that frame infinity. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent to human ambitions, continuing their eternal rotations while empires rise and fall beneath them. While kings succeed kings and dynasties replace dynasties, and the empire that seems permanent proves temporary, proves as transient as human life itself, proves subject to the same mortality that claims individual rulers and eventually claims the systems they build. We close with image of young Xerxes standing at a window, looking out across gardens that descend in terraces toward plains that stretch beyond sight, gardens where water channels carry liquid from distant mountains to create paradise in a landscape that without irrigation would support only thorn and scorpion. The gardens are achievement, our demonstration of human will imposing order on nature, our vision of what empire could be productive, beautiful, sustainable. But they require constant maintenance, require the water to flow, require the channels to be cleaned and the walls to be repaired and the system to function. Stop the maintenance and the gardens die, the desert reclaims what human effort created, the paradise becomes wilderness again. The metaphor is obvious but apt. The empire is the garden, vast and diverse and productive. The great king is the gardener, responsible for maintenance, for ensuring the water flows, for directing resources where they're needed, for removing threats before they spread. But the garden has grown too large, has extended beyond what any gardener can personally tend, has become system that can only function if the systems themselves function, if the satraps and inspectors and administrators and soldiers all do their assigned tasks, if the machine runs smoothly, if nothing breaks. Xerxes inherits the garden at its maximum extent. His challenge will not be to expand, it will be to maintain it, to keep it functioning, to prevent its dissolution into the chaos that always threatens at empire's edges, where Persian authority fades and local powers assert themselves and the question of who really rules remains perpetually contested. The throne waits. The stars wheel, the prince becomes king. And the empire holds its breath, waiting to see what kind of king he will be, whether he will maintain what his fathers built or whether his reign will be the beginning of the end. The moment when the empire starts its slow dissolution that will culminate 2 centuries later when Alexander conquers Persia and the Achaemenid line ends, and the empire becomes memory carved in ruins at Persepolis. At the heart of Persepolis lies a garden, not wild growth but ordered paradise, a vision of Eden made manifest through water channeled from distant mountains through underground canal systems that ancient engineers carved, through trees planted in geometric patterns that mirror celestial arrangements that Persian astronomers observed and recorded, through flowers that bloom in colors Cyrus the Great once saw in desert mirages and commanded to be cultivated in courts where no flowers should grow. This is the paradisa, the walled enclosure from which the word paradise descends, the space where Persian kings walked among cypress and pomegranate, where they contemplated the burden of ruling a realm that encompassed every people, every faith, every dream of what humanity might become. We wander these gardens at twilight when the fierce heat of the Iranian plateau's summer day begins to release its grip, when shadows lengthen across carefully raked gravel paths, when fountains murmur their eternal conversations with stone basins that receive and reflect, that hold water briefly before releasing it to flow to the next pool, to the next terrace, to the irrigation channels that transform desert into garden. The air carries scents of roses, damask roses that Persians cultivated and that later centuries would carry to Europe, would make essential to European gardens, would transform into symbols of romance and beauty while forgetting their Persian origins. The air carries myrrh and frankincense, carried here from Punt and Arabia, reminding that the empire's reach extended to the world's edges, brought back not just tribute but the very sense of distant lands. The garden is not merely aesthetic achievement, is theological statement, is political vision made landscape, is demonstration of what empire means and what it could accomplish. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the world is battlefield between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, god of truth and order and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, source of chaos and falsehood and darkness. Human life is participation in this cosmic struggle. Every choice between truth and lie, between order and chaos, between productive creation and destructive negation, is taking sides in war that transcends individual lives. That began before humans existed and will continue until the final renovation, when Ahura Mazda triumphs and evil is destroyed forever. The garden embodies this theology. The wilderness beyond the walls is chaos, is the realm where Angra Mainyu's influence is visible in scorpion and snake and drought, in the absence of water and abundance of thorns, in the hostility of nature to human flourishing. The garden is order imposed on chaos, is truth creating space where humans can live and thrive, is water brought to desert and desert transformed into paradise through human will aligned with divine purpose. The great king as gardener is not just metaphor but is theological reality, is participating in cosmic struggle, is advancing truth and order against falsehood and chaos, is doing Ahura Mazda's work by creating conditions where humans can flourish. The political implications are obvious and were intended to be obvious. The empire is the garden extended, is paradise offered to all peoples who accept Persian sovereignty, is order that prevents the chaos of constant warfare between competing peoples, is peace that allows trade and agriculture and culture to flourish, is protection against the wilderness, both literal wilderness beyond the empire's borders and metaphorical wilderness of anarchy and conflict that threatens whenever central authority weakens. And to resist the empire is to choose chaos over order, is to ally with Angra Mainyu against Ahura Mazda, is to reject paradise and embrace wilderness. But the vision was not entirely propaganda. The Persian Empire genuinely was more tolerant than most ancient empires, genuinely did allow subject peoples to maintain their languages and religions and customs with less interference than they would experience under most conquerors. The Cyrus Cylinder, that clay document proclaiming Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, declares that Cyrus restored displaced peoples to their homelands, rebuilt their temples, allowed them to worship their gods. The Jews' return from Babylonian exile and rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple happened under Persian auspices. Was Persian policy of allowing subject peoples to maintain their identities while submitting to Persian political authority. The tolerance was not altruistic, was pragmatic recognition that forcing uniformity on such diverse territories would be impossible, would require resources empire didn't have, would create constant rebellions that would drain more resources than tolerating diversity cost. Better to allow local customs and religions and languages to persist, to govern through local elites who maintained authority in their own communities while submitting to Persian overlordship, to extract tribute and military service while leaving daily life relatively undisturbed. The pragmatism created what seemed like paradise. People could worship their gods, speak their languages, follow their customs, live much as they had before conquest as long as they paid taxes, provided soldiers when required, and accepted that ultimate authority rested with the great king in distant Persepolis. We trace water flowing through channels that engineers carved into stone, following liquid paths that connect pool to pool, that sustain life in landscape where without human intervention only thorn and scorpion would thrive. The engineering is sophisticated, demonstrates knowledge and skill that ancient civilizations possessed but that we sometimes forget because we assume technological progress is linear, assume ancient peoples were primitive because they lacked our tools. But they were not primitive, they were humans as intelligent as us, as capable of observation and reasoning and problem-solving, lacking only the accumulated knowledge that later generations would build upon. The qanat systems that bring water to Iranian gardens from sources miles away, that use gravity to move water through underground channels that prevent evaporation, that can sustain cities in deserts where rainfall is minimal. These demonstrate engineering genius that served empire as surely as military conquest did. The inscriptions Xerxes left speak of his building projects, his additions to Persepolis, his continuation of his father's work. Darius the king made much that is good. This I, Xerxes the Great King, have completed and improved. The words reveal Xerxes's position. He was completing his father's vision, was finishing what Darius began, was consolidating rather than innovating, was preserver rather than creator. The role might seem diminished compared to his great-grandfather Cyrus, who founded the empire, or his father Darius, who expanded it to its maximum extent. But preservation is itself achievement. Maintaining what predecessors built requires effort and skill. Preventing dissolution requires constant attention and intervention. The gardens reveal that paradise requires gardeners, that order requires maintenance, that without constant care the water stops flowing, and the channels fill with silt, and the trees die, and the wilderness reclaims what was briefly paradise. The empire is no different, requires satraps to govern, soldiers to guard, officials to collect taxes, engineers to maintain roads, scribes to keep records, priests to perform rituals, the great king to coordinate all of it, to make decisions, to judge disputes, to reward loyalty and punish rebellion, to embody the authority that makes the system function. But the system is vast, is complex beyond any individual's capacity to fully comprehend, is mechanism that has momentum of its own, that functions according to established procedures even when those procedures no longer serve their original purposes, that resists change even when change is necessary. Xerxes inherited this system, attempted to maintain it, would discover that maintaining the status quo in changing circumstances is itself a kind of change. That standing still while the world moves forward is moving backward relative to the world. That preservation can become ossification. That gardens can become wildernesses if the gardener maintains the forms without understanding the purposes. We stand at a fountain as evening deepens into night, watching starlight reflected in still water, listening to the whisper of flow that sustains the garden. The reflection is broken by ripples, the still surface disturbed by drops that fall from fountainhead above, creating patterns that spread outward in expanding circles, overlapping, interfering, creating complexity from simple disturbance. The metaphor is there if we want it. The empire is the pool, disturbances are rebellions and invasions and the death of kings. The ripples are consequences spreading outward through interconnected systems, affecting regions far from the source of disturbance, creating patterns that no one intended but that emerge from the system's structure. Xerxes will create disturbances, will invade Greece, will suppress rebellions, will build and destroy, will make decisions that will ripple through the empire and through history. But he cannot foresee the patterns that will emerge, cannot predict how his choices will interact with circumstances beyond his control, cannot know which actions will strengthen the empire and which will weaken it. He can only act according to his understanding, his training, his culture's assumptions about what kings should do and how empires should function. Whether those assumptions are correct, whether the traditions that shaped him are adequate to the challenges he faces, these are questions that can only be answered afterward, can only be judged by results that he will not live to fully see. The garden where empires dream stands quiet now in starlight. The channels still carry water, the fountains still flow, the paradise still persists in ruins that tourists visit and archaeologists study. But the empire is gone, the great king is dust, the system that seemed eternal proved temporary. The garden outlasted the gardener, the dream outlasted the dreamer. But both garden and dream are fragments now, are partial preservation of what was complete, are testimony to achievement that could not prevent its own eventual dissolution. We close with the scent of roses drifting on night air, with the sound of water flowing in darkness, with the weight of what was attempted here, the dream that empire could be paradise, that order could overcome chaos, that human will aligned with divine purpose could create spaces where all peoples might dwell in peace. The dream failed, but gardens still grow, water still flows. And somewhere in the ruins, the dream persists wounded, diminished, but not quite dead, not quite forgotten. still suggesting what might have been if circumstances had been different, if choices had been different, if history had bent another direction. The Hellespont is narrow, barely a mile, where Europe and Asia come closest to touching, where modern Turkey nearly reaches Greece, where the Dardanelles Strait connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, where currents run strong and winds shift unpredictably, and crossing even in small boat is dangerous unless conditions are favorable. In ancient times, the crossing was barrier that few armies attempted, was boundary that separated continents, was one of those natural obstacles that defined where civilizations ended and where expansion became impractical if not impossible. But Xerxes stood on the Asian shore in 480 BCE, looking across toward Europe, toward Greece that had humiliated his father Darius at Marathon, toward lands that must be conquered if Persian Empire was to be complete, if the dream of universal sovereignty was to be realized, if the Greeks were to be punished for their insolence in resisting Persian power and supporting the Ionian cities' rebellion against Persian rule. And Xerxes ordered the impossible: build a bridge, join the continents, make the waters between them into a road that armies could cross, that would carry Persia's might into the heart of Greece, that would demonstrate that no natural barrier could prevent the great king's will from being accomplished. The engineering was extraordinary, the logistics, the planning, the sheer audacity of attempting something that had never been done before at this scale. Herodotus, our primary source for these events, describes the construction in detail that suggests he had access to accounts from those who witnessed it or participated in it. The bridge was actually two bridges side by side, each constructed from hundreds of ships' pentaconters and triremes, 50-oared and 3-banked rowing vessels lashed together gunwale to gunwale, anchored against the current's pull, positioned to allow traffic to flow in both directions simultaneously. Across the ships, massive cables were laid, flax cables for one bridge, papyrus cables for the other, each cable requiring the strength of hundreds of men to move, each representing technological achievement in rope-making and load-bearing calculation that ancient engineers somehow managed without modern mathematics or materials science. Over the cables, planking was laid, timbers cut and fitted to create solid roadway where none had existed, where water had flowed since before humans existed to imagine that water might be transformed into road. Over the planking, earth and brushwood were spread, creating surface that would not spook horses or cause soldiers to stumble, that would seem like solid ground despite the gentle sway that revealed the bridge's true nature. The construction required months, required thousands of workers, required procurement of materials from across the empire, ships from Phoenician and Egyptian and Ionian fleets, timber from forests in Anatolia and Thrace, rope made in workshops throughout the eastern Mediterranean, engineers and laborers gathered from provinces that probably had little understanding of why their great king needed a bridge across water barely a mile wide when boats could ferry an army across in days or weeks. But Xerxes's vision was not merely practical, was symbolic, was statement that empire recognized no boundaries, that what seemed impossible to others was mere engineering problem to be solved by Persian ingenuity and resources, that nature itself would submit to great king's will. But nature did not cooperate. Storms destroyed the first bridges before armies could cross, tore apart the ships lashed together, scattered the timbers, undid in hours what had taken months to build. The destruction was both practical disaster requiring rebuilding, causing delays, consuming resources, and symbolic catastrophe, suggesting that gods opposed the venture, that nature itself rejected the hubris of bridge building, that perhaps the invasion was doomed before it began. And Xerxes, whether in genuine rage or in theatrical display meant to demonstrate his absolute authority, ordered the sea punished. The account comes from Herodotus, who may have invented or exaggerated to make the Persian king seem like a madman defying nature itself, who had political and cultural motives for portraying Xerxes as tyrant whose arrogance exceeded all reasonable limits. But the account has persisted across 25 centuries because it captures something essential about how Greeks perceived Persian kingship, about how the ideology of absolute monarchy could lead to actions that seemed insane to those outside the system. Herodotus reports that Xerxes ordered 300 lashes for the Hellespont, ordered chains thrown into the depths to bind the disobedient waters, ordered a branding iron to mark the sea as slave to the great king's will. The punishers were to speak while they worked, were to say, "Bitter water, your master thus punishes you because you did him wrong though he had done you none. King Xerxes will cross you whether you wish it or not. It is just that no one sacrifices to you, you turbid and briny stream." The story is probably false or exaggerated. But even if Xerxes did not literally order the sea whipped and chained, the story reveals how Greeks understood Persian kingship's claims that great king's authority was absolute, that his will should be obeyed by humans and nature alike, that failure to submit merited punishment regardless of whether the disobedient party was human or elemental, animate or inanimate. The story makes Xerxes seem ridiculous, makes Persian monarchy seem absurd, makes the invasion seem like vanity project by deluded tyrant who thought he could command the sea. But there is another reading. Perhaps the punishment was ritual, was religious ceremony meant to appease gods who had destroyed the bridges, was acknowledgement that nature has divine aspect that must be addressed through proper procedures. And perhaps the lashing and chaining were symbolic actions meant to assert control psychologically if not physically, meant to demonstrate to the army and to the empire that the great king would not be deterred by natural obstacles, that setbacks would be overcome, that the invasion would proceed regardless of difficulties. Perhaps the entire account is Greek propaganda, is story invented or distorted to make Xerxes seem like the tyrant that Greek ideology required Persians to be, is caricature rather than accurate description. What we know is that the bridges were rebuilt, that the second attempt succeeded, that Xerxes did cross from Asia to Europe at the head of an army that Herodotus claimed numbered over 2 million, but that modern historians estimate at perhaps 200,000, still enormous by ancient standards. still larger than any force Greece had ever faced, still army that seemed to include warriors from every corner of the known world. That demonstrated Persian power and reach and the resources that empire could mobilize when the great king commanded. We stand at the bridge, or where the bridge was, where the Dardanelles still flow, where modern ferries carry vehicles and tourists between continents, where the narrowness of the crossing is still obvious, where the currents still run strong and the task of bridging still seems daunting even with modern materials and technology. We imagine the sight, hundreds of ships lashed together, stretching across the strait, covered with planking and earth, looking like solid ground where water should be, violating nature's order through human engineering and will. We imagine Xerxes crossing not in humility but in triumph, not acknowledging the sea's power but demonstrating his own, not as supplicant to gods but as their chosen instrument, as great king whose authority derived from Ahura Mazda and who therefore had divine sanction for the invasion, who was fulfilling cosmic purpose by bringing order to Greek chaos, by extending empire's beneficent rule to peoples who didn't know they needed it. Who resisted because they didn't understand that submission to Persia was submission to truth and order and the proper arrangement of the world. The bridge is gone now, the ships are long since rotted, the timbers have dissolved into atoms scattered by currents across the Aegean and the Marmara and the Mediterranean. But the crossing happened, the continents were joined however briefly, the impossible was accomplished, and empire marched into Europe intent on conquest that would either complete the Persian vision of universal sovereignty or would mark the limit of empire's expansion, would either confirm that Persia was destiny's chosen instrument or would prove that even the greatest empire has boundaries beyond which it cannot extend, has ambitions it cannot fulfill, has visions it cannot realize. The question hung in the air as armies crossed. Would Greece submit as Egypt and Babylon and so many others had submitted? Or would the Greeks do what seemed impossible? Would they resist? Would they fight? Would they somehow prevent empire from absorbing them? Would they maintain their independence and in doing so set limit to Persian expansion, create boundary that empire could not cross, demonstrate that even great kings will has limits and that those limits are determined not by the king's ambition, but by the will to resist and the capacity to make that resistance effective. The bridge joined two worlds. But joining them did not make them one. The crossing was engineering triumph and strategic gamble, was demonstration of Persian capability and revelation of Persian vulnerability, was moment of imperial confidence and beginning of imperial doubt. The bridge would not stand long, would be dismantled, or would collapse, or would be destroyed by Greeks after the invasion failed. But for the moments when it stood, when the continents touched, when armies crossed from Asia to Europe, the bridge was symbol of what empire meant and what it attempted to make all the world one, to eliminate boundaries, to create unity through conquest, to join what nature had separated, and in so doing to demonstrate that human will aligned with divine purpose could reshape reality itself. We close with image of the last soldier crossing, of the bridge empty behind him, of the moment before the invasion truly begins, before the armies meet Greek resistance, before Thermopylae and Athens and Salamis, before the fate of the venture is determined. The bridge is still intact, still joining continents, still demonstrating the possible. But ahead lies the uncertain, the unforeseen, the limitations that will test whether confidence was warranted or whether it was hubris, whether the dream of universal empire can be fulfilled or whether it will break against Greek determination to remain free. The bridge stands, the crossing is complete, the invasion begins, and history holds its breath, waiting to see which force will prevail: imperial power or determined resistance, the ocean of Persian might or the rock of Greek resolve. They came from every corner of the empire, a procession that seemed endless, that took days to pass any single point, that stretched back along the roads from the Hellespont through Thrace and Macedonia into Asia, until the tail of the column was still crossing the bridge while the head was already deep in Greek territory. Herodotus tried to catalogue them, tried to describe the diversity that marched under Persian banners, tried to convey to his Greek readers the sheer magnitude of what faced their ancestors, the sense that the world itself was marching toward them, that every people had sent warriors to join the great king's conquest. The Persians themselves came first in the procession, wearing tiaras on their heads, soft felt caps that marked them as the empire's ruling people, dressed in colorful embroidered robes that seemed impractical for warfare, but that proclaimed status. That said, these were not mere soldiers but were members of the nation that ruled all others. They carried wicker shields covered with leather, short spears, great bows that could launch arrows farther than Greek bows could match, swords hanging from belts, daggers strapped to their right thighs. They were cavalry as much as infantry, were warriors who fought mounted when terrain allowed, who used mobility and archery to harry enemies before closing for hand-to-hand combat. The Medes came next, dressed similarly to Persians. The two peoples were related, had once been separate kingdoms before Cyrus united them, now formed the core of the empire's military and administrative elite. Then came the Assyrians with bronze helmets and linen corselets, carrying clubs studded with iron, preserving martial traditions from when Assyria had been empire itself, when Nineveh had ruled the Near East and Assyrian kings had carved boasts of conquest on palace walls. Then Bactrians with cane bows and short spears, warriors from the eastern marches where empire bordered the steppes, where Persian authority faded into the territories of nomads who submitted when Persian armies were present and rebelled when they departed. The Indians came wearing garments of cotton, that plant fiber unknown to Greeks, that material so different from wool and linen that Herodotus devoted space to describing it, to explaining how it grew and how it was processed and how Indians wore it as Greeks wore wool. The Indians carried cane bows and cane arrows tipped with iron, fought as light infantry, provided numbers and exotic presents that made the army seem even more vast and various than it already was. The Ethiopians came wrapped in leopard skins and lion pelts, their bodies painted half white and half red, carrying long bows made of palm wood and arrows tipped with sharpened stone instead of iron, spears whose points were antelope horns, clubs studded with knobs. They came from the empire's southern edge, from regions where Persian control was nominal, where tributary relationship was more important than direct administration, where the great king's authority was acknowledged more in theory than in practice but was acknowledged nonetheless, was sufficient to bring warriors from Africa to fight in Europe for causes that could not have meant anything to them beyond the obligation to serve when called. The Thracians wore foxskin caps and patterned cloaks, carried small shields and javelins, fought with a curved sword called a sika that would later become associated with assassins and bandits, but that in this context was simply traditional weapon of a warrior people who lived between the empire and Greece, who had submitted to Persian authority and now provided troops for the invasion. The Arabs rode camels, wore long robes that flowed behind them as they moved, carried long bows and fought as mobile archers, harassing enemies from distance before withdrawing before counterattack could reach them. Herodotus claimed the army numbered 1,700,000 infantry and 80,000 cavalry, plus support personnel that brought the total to over 5 million. The numbers cannot be believed. Logistics would have been impossible, supply requirements would have exceeded what any ancient economy could provide. The army would have consumed more food daily than could have been transported or requisitioned from territories it passed through. Modern estimates reduce the numbers dramatically, perhaps 200,000 total, perhaps 300,000, perhaps as low as 70,000 to 80,000. But even reduced, the army was enormous by ancient standards, was larger than any force Greece had ever faced, was coalition of nations rather than single people. But diversity was double-edged. The army's variety demonstrated imperial power, showed that Persia ruled the world and that the world marched under Persian banners. But variety also meant fragmentation, meant soldiers who could not speak to each other, who could not coordinate except through layers of translation, who did not share identity or purpose beyond obedience to the great king's command. The Persian army was bound together by hierarchy and discipline and fear of punishment rather than by the organic unity that made Greek hoplites willing to die beside their neighbors, that made citizens of the same polis into single organism on battlefield, that created cohesion that professional multi-ethnic imperial army could not replicate. The tactical implications were significant. Persian tactics relied on archery and cavalry, on shooting arrows to disrupt enemy formations before cavalry charged or before infantry advanced to finish enemies who were already wounded and disorganized. The tactics worked against many opponents, had conquered territories from the Indus to the Nile, had proven effective across diverse terrain and against diverse enemies. But the tactics struggled against Greek hoplite phalanx, heavily armored infantry, fighting in tight formation with overlapping shields and long spears, creating wall of bronze that arrows could not penetrate effectively, that cavalry could not break, that required frontal assault by infantry to overcome, and frontal assault against prepared hoplite phalanx was suicide unless the attackers had significant numerical advantage or tactical innovation that could exploit weaknesses in the formation. Xerxes had the numerical advantage. His army vastly outnumbered any force Greece could field. But numbers alone were not sufficient. They needed to be applied effectively, needed terrain that allowed them to be deployed, needed coordination and logistics and command structure that could manage forces spread across miles of territory. That could ensure that when battle came, the Persian advantage in numbers would actually matter, would actually translate into tactical superiority rather than becoming liability as troops crowded together and got in each other's way. We walk among the encampment, hearing languages we cannot count, seeing faces that range from pale-skinned Scythians to dark Ethiopians, observing weapons and armor and tactics as diverse as the lands they come from. Each contingent camps with its own people, speaks its own language, maintains its own customs. The Persians camp separately from the Medes, who camp separately from the Bactrians, who camp separately from the Indians. The army is not single unit but is collection of units, each with its own identity and loyalty, united only by common service to the great king and by the discipline that enforces that service. The great king himself moves among the army, inspecting troops, receiving reports from commanders, making decisions about routes and supplies and deployment. Xerxes' visible presence is reminder of whose authority commands the army, whose will determines strategy, whose person embodies the empire and its purpose. But one man cannot command such vastness directly, must rely on subordinates, must trust that orders will be transmitted accurately through the layers of command, must hope that the system will function as designed when battle comes and when chaos inevitably disrupts the beslaid plans. The logistical challenge was staggering. An army of 200,000 consumes perhaps 200 tons of food daily, grain for bread, meat when available, wine or water for drinking. The grain must come from somewhere, must be procured from territories the army passes through, or must be transported from magazines established in advance. The transport requires thousands of pack animals, requires wagons and carts, requires roads capable of handling the traffic, requires organization that can coordinate movement of supplies to match movement of army. The water requirements are even more pressing. Soldiers can survive days without food but not without water, and finding water sources sufficient for hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of animals was constant challenge that shaped routes and determined where army could go. The ancient sources mention the rivers that ran dry as the Persian army drank them, mention the fields stripped bare as soldiers and animals consumed everything edible, mention the terror that local populations felt as this vast force moved through their territories like plague of locusts, taking what it needed and leaving devastation behind. The accounts may exaggerate, but the fundamental point is sound. An army this size was ecological disaster, was force that could not be sustained indefinitely in any region, that had to keep moving or starve, that had to conquer quickly or retreat before logistics collapsed, and the army dissolved not through military defeat but through inability to feed itself. The timeline mattered. The invasion began in spring of 480 BCE, timing that allowed the army to march through summer when food was most available, when rivers were flowing from snowmelt, when weather was least likely to disrupt operations. But summer meant that by autumn, decisions had to be made: either the invasion succeeded and Greece submitted, and the army could be partially demobilized and dispersed into winter quarters, or the invasion stalled and the army had to retreat back across the Hellespont before winter made the crossing impossible, and before food supplies in Greece ran out, and before the impossibility of maintaining such a force in hostile territory became catastrophic. The army was both Xerxes's strength and his constraint. Was tool of overwhelming power that could crush any Greek force in direct confrontation, that could besiege cities and ravage territories and terrorize populations into submission. But was also burden that required constant feeding and moving and managing, that imposed timeline that could not be adjusted, that forced strategic decisions based on logistical necessity rather than on tactical opportunity. That meant Xerxes could not wait, could not maneuver, could not employ patience as strategy because the army's needs were immediate and unrelenting. We close with image of the army on the march, stretching along the coastal road from the Hellespont toward Thessaly, moving in column that takes days to pass, raising dust clouds that can be seen for miles, creating noise that announces its approach long before the vanguard appears, transforming the landscape it moves through simply by its presence. The army of all nations, the force that represented the world arrayed against Greece, the military instrument of imperial will, the demonstration that Persia was power unlike any the Greeks had faced, that resistance was futile, that submission was inevitable. But ahead lie the passes, the narrows where numbers matter less, the places where determined Greeks can hold positions that larger forces cannot outflank, can fight on terms that favor heavy infantry over cavalry and archers, can prove that size is not everything, that courage and position and desperation can overcome numerical superiority, that empires might has limits, and those limits are defined not by what empire can bring to battle, but by what defenders can withstand. There is a place where mountains meet the sea, where the coastal path narrows to barely 50 feet in some sections, where cliffs rise sheer on one side and waves crash on the other, where an army, however vast, can be stopped by a few hundred determined men willing to die. The Greeks call it Thermopylae, hot gates, for the thermal springs that bubble from the earth nearby, where warmth rises from hidden chambers below ground as if from Hades itself, where the boundary between the world of the living and the underworld seems thin, where those who fight know they stand at threshold between life and death, between victory and oblivion, between resistance and submission. Here Leonidas and his 300 Spartans made their stand, along with perhaps 7,000 allies from various Greek cities: Thespians and Thebans, Phocians and Locrians, Corinthians and Arcadians, all gathered at this narrow place where geography favored the defender, where the vast Persian army could not deploy its numbers, where the invasion could be stopped or at least delayed. where time could be bought for Athens to evacuate and for the Greek fleet to prepare for the naval battle that everyone knew would determine the war's outcome. The position was strong but not perfect. The pass could be held against frontal assault. The narrowness prevented the Persians from bringing their numerical superiority to bear, forced them to attack in columns narrow enough that Greek heavy infantry could match them, could fight on equal terms despite being vastly outnumbered. But the pass could be flanked. There was a mountain path, the Thermopylae, that went around the position that could allow enemy forces to get behind the Greek line and attack from both directions. Leonidas knew about the path, posted the Phocian contingent to guard it, took reasonable precautions against the obvious danger. For 2 days the Greeks held. The Persians attacked in waves and were slaughtered in waves, their light infantry no match for Greek heavy infantry in close combat, their numerical advantage meaningless in the narrow pass where only a few men could fight at once, where Greek long spears could reach Persian swordsmen before the swordsmen could close, where Greek shields overlapped to create wall of bronze that Persian light shields could not penetrate. The bodies piled up, creating obstacles that had to be cleared before the next wave could attack, creating horror that should have broken morale, but that seemed only to make the Persians more determined. Xerxes watched from his golden throne, positioned where he could observe the battle, where he could see his forces being destroyed against the Greek position. Herodotus claims he leaped from his throne 3 times in fear for his army, 3 times saw disaster unfolding and could not prevent it, 3 times was forced to acknowledge that his vast forces were powerless against the narrow geography and the determined Greeks who held it. The account may be invention, may be Greek propaganda designed to humiliate the great king, but it captures something true: that numbers could not overcome position, that empire's might was insufficient when terrain favored the defender, that all the diversity and power and resources that the Persian army represented could not force the pass while the Greeks held it. On the 2nd day, Xerxes sent in the immortals his elite guard, 10,000 strong, supposedly never numbering less than 10,000 because fallen warriors were immediately replaced, the best troops in the Persian army, the unit that had never failed in battle, that had conquered from the Indus to the Nile, that embodied Persian military excellence. And even the immortals were broken against the Greek phalanx. Even the elite could not penetrate the wall of shields and spears. Even the best that Persia could field was insufficient to overcome position and determination and the desperate courage of men fighting for their homes, for their cities, for their freedom. Then came betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes, his name would become synonymous with nightmare in later Greek usage, would become the word for the bad dreams that torment sleep, came to Xerxes and offered to show the Persians the mountain path, the route around the pass, the way to get behind the Greek position and attack from both directions. The motive was probably money, was the reward that Xerxes offered for information, was simple greed, or was complex resentment, or was pragmatic recognition that the Greeks could not hold. and that being on the winning side when the inevitable happened was better than dying pointlessly with those who resisted the inevitable. Ephialtes led a Persian force under Hydarnes up the mountain path during the night. The Phocians guarding the path heard them coming, took position to fight, but then withdrew to higher ground when they realized they were outnumbered, abandoned the path to save themselves, left the route open for the Persians to descend behind the Greek position. When scouts brought word to Leonidas that the Persians were behind him, that the position was compromised, that remaining meant certain death without hope of victory, he made decision that would echo through 25 centuries. And he dismissed most of the allies, sent them to withdraw while they could, kept his 300 Spartans and some others who refused to leave the Thespians whose city would be destroyed if Greece fell, and who therefore had nothing to retreat to, the Thebans who may have been kept as hostages to ensure their city's good behavior or who may have volunteered to stay. The reasons for staying have been debated endlessly. Spartan law supposedly forbade retreat to return from battle without victory was shame worse than death, was violation of warrior code that made Sparta what it was. But Spartans had retreated before when circumstances required it, had been pragmatic as well as rigid, had valued effectiveness over adherence to ideals that led to pointless sacrifice. And perhaps Leonidas stayed because he believed that delaying the Persians even one more day was worth 300 Spartan lives, that buying time for the fleet to prepare was worth the sacrifice. Perhaps Oracle had prophesied that Sparta would survive only if a king died defending it, and Leonidas chose to fulfill the prophecy, to save his city through his death. Perhaps he simply could not bear to be the Spartan king who retreated, who abandoned position, who survived while others died, whose memory would be shame rather than glory. Whatever the reason, the 300 stayed, made final stand that became legend even before the battle ended, even before the last Spartan fell. They fought at the narrowest point of the pass until the Persians flanked them, fought withdrawing to a hillock where they could defend briefly, fought until their spears broke and they fought with swords, fought until swords shattered and they fought with hands and teeth and anything they could use as weapon. They fought until the Persian arrows darkened the sky famously. When a Spartan warrior named Dineses was told that Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun, he replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." They fought until none remained standing, until 300 Spartans had demonstrated what Spartan training created, what the agoge produced, what it meant to be warrior who would not yield, who could not retreat, who chose death over dishonor. The Persians buried their own dead hastily. Herodotus reports that Xerxes ordered many Persian corpses buried secretly so his troops would not realize how costly the victory had been, so morale would not suffer from recognition that even in victory the losses had been catastrophic. The Greek dead were left where they fell until after the war, until after the Persian invasion had been defeated and Greeks returned to Thermopylae to honor those who had died there. A stone lion was erected for Leonidas, inscriptions were carved. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." The epitaph attributed to the poet Simonides captured the Spartan ethos perfectly, not glorifying courage or mourning death but simply noting obedience, noting that the fallen had done what their laws required, nothing more, nothing less. We stand at the pass as evening falls, as shadows lengthen across ground that has changed since ancient times. The coastline has shifted, the sea has receded, the thermal springs still flow, but the pass is wider now than it was then. The place where the 300 died is perhaps a quarter-mile from the modern coast. But the mountains still rise, the position is still obviously defensible, the logic of the stand is still clear: here or nowhere, now or never, resist or submit. The ghosts are present if we allow ourselves to feel them, not literal spirits, but the weight of memory, the accumulation of 25 centuries of storytelling and commemoration and cultural meaning attached to this place. Thermopylae has become more than battle, has become symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, of courage in face of certain death, of free men choosing to die rather than to submit, of the moment when Western civilization's character was forged in blood and determination, and the recognition that some things are worth dying for, that freedom has price, and that sometimes that price must be paid in full. But we must also question the legend, must acknowledge the complications. The stand delayed the Persians perhaps 2 or 3 days, significant but not decisive, bought time but did not prevent the invasion from continuing. Athens still burned, Greece was still overrun, the Persian army still marched south. The tactical value of the sacrifice was limited, the strategic value was in morale, in demonstrating that Persians could be fought and killed, that Greek heavy infantry was superior to Persian troops in close combat, that resistance was possible even if particular resistance was doomed. And we must acknowledge that not everyone stayed willingly. The Thebans may have been hostages rather than volunteers, may have died not from choice but from Leonidas's decision that they could not be allowed to leave lest they warn the Persians or betray Greek positions. The allies who were dismissed may have felt relief rather than shame, may have been grateful to survive rather than resentful at not being allowed to share in the glory. The Spartans themselves were products of brutal training system that traumatized boys to create warriors incapable of retreat. Their courage was real, but was also conditioned response, was result of systematic psychological modification that began at age 7 and continued until they became soldiers who literally could not imagine backing down. The complications do not negate the courage, do not diminish the sacrifice, but do remind us that history is always more complex than legend, that heroes are humans with constraints and conditioned responses and limited choices, that even the most celebrated sacrifices happen in contexts that shape what seems possible and what seems necessary. Leonidas and the 300 were extraordinary, were genuinely courageous, deserve the honor they have received. But they were also Spartans shaped by Spartan culture, were products of system that created warriors who could not be anything other than what they were men whose choice to die was partly free decision and partly inevitable consequence of everything they had been taught and everything they had become. We close as darkness fills the pass, as the thermal springs steam in cooling air, as modern cars pass along the highway that now runs where ancient warriors died, as tourists take photographs and read plaques and try to imagine what it was like when the pass ran red and the mountain of bodies grew and the 300 stood against the world. The hot gates remember. The stones carry more than mineral deposits, carry more than the iron from ancient springs, carry memory, carry weight, carry the accumulated significance of moment when free men chose death over submission. When resistance became legend, when the pass became sacred ground, when Thermopylae became not just place but idea, symbol, touchstone for every subsequent generation that had to decide whether to resist or to submit, whether to stand or to run, whether to pay the price that freedom demands or to accept the safety that submission offers. The pass is quiet now. The battle is long over, the warriors are dust, but the choice they made remains, the example they set persists, the question they answered echoes still. What will you die for? What matters enough to sacrifice everything? When the impossible is demanded, what will you do? Thermopylae answers, stand, fight, die if necessary, but do not yield, do not submit. Do not accept that might makes right or that overwhelming force determines outcome. Resist, even when resistance is hopeless, especially when resistance is hopeless. Resist because resistance is what free people do, because submission is living death, because some things matter more than survival. The lesson is extremism is dangerous, is the kind of thinking that leads to fanaticism and unnecessary sacrifice and deaths that could have been prevented through pragmatism and compromise. But the lesson is also truth, is recognition that freedom is never free, that tyranny triumphs when no one resists, that evil succeeds when good people calculate that resistance costs too much. Thermopylae gives no easy answers, offers no comfortable middle ground, offers only the pass, the 300, the choice they made, the price they paid, the legend they became, hot gates, sacred ground, the place where men became myths, the stand that became eternal. When the Persian army approached Athens, threading south through Boeotia after breaking through Thermopylae, after scattering the Greek forces that had tried to hold the northern approaches, the city was empty. Not abandoned in panic, was evacuated in cold calculation, was decision made weeks earlier when it became clear that Athens could not be defended by walls, that the city's only hope was the fleet, that the wooden ships Themistocles had persuaded Athens to build with silver from Laurium mines were now the walls that would protect Athenian lives if not Athenian stone. The evacuation was organized chaos. The men of military age went to the fleet, became rowers and marines, filled the triremes that would fight at Salamis. The women and children and elderly went to Salamis Island and to Troezen across the Saronic Gulf, went to places where Persian army could not easily reach them, where they would be safe while their city burned, where they could wait for either victory that would allow them to return or defeat that would mean they would never return, would mean the end of Athens not just as city but as idea, as experiment in democracy, as challenge to the assumption that humans must be ruled by kings or tyrants or oligarchs. Not everyone left. Some stayed, the old who refused to abandon homes, the poor who had nowhere to go, the believers who thought the Acropolis's ancient wooden wall would protect them as Oracle had supposedly promised, as divine favor would surely provide. They barricaded themselves on the Acropolis, prepared to defend the sacred hill, waited for the Persians to arrive and for the gods to intervene, for the miracle that would save them even though the city around them was being abandoned, even though the strategy required sacrifice of stone to save flesh, required letting the city burn to preserve the people. The Persians came, climbed the Acropolis despite its steep approaches, broke through the barricades, killed the defenders who remained, set fire to the temples, to the old temple of Athena, to the sacred buildings that housed the city's most precious dedications, to the olive tree that Athena herself had supposedly planted when she competed with Poseidon for patronage of the city, to everything that made the Acropolis sacred, that embodied Athens's identity, that connected the present city to its mythical past and to the gods who protected it. The destruction was both revenge and demonstration. Revenge for the burning of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt, when Athenian soldiers had participated in the attack on that Persian provincial capital, when temples had burned and Persian governors had been humiliated, when Greek interference in Persian territory had first brought Athens to Persian attention as problem requiring solution. The burning of Athens was payback, was message that attacking Persian cities brought consequences, was warning to other Greek cities that resistance would be punished, that submission was required, that Persian power would not tolerate defiance. But the destruction was also demonstration of Persian dominance, was proof that Greek cities could not defend themselves against imperial might, was intended to terrorize the remaining Greeks into submission, to show that walls could not protect them, that gods would not save them, that resistance was futile, and that accepting Persian rule was the only realistic option. Xerxes stood in the burned city, walked through the ruins, climbed the Acropolis to see what his soldiers had destroyed, to witness the completion of the task that his father Darius had begun, to stand where Athenian democracy had flourished and to proclaim that Persian autocracy had triumphed. But the Athenians were not in their city. Were watching from Salamis Island, across the narrow strait that separated the island from the mainland, watching smoke rise over the Acropolis, watching their temples burn, watching everything their ancestors had built being reduced to ash and rubble. The sight must have been devastating, was loss not just of buildings but of history, not just of property but of identity, not just of present but of connection to past that gave meaning to present and hope for future. Yet they did not surrender. Did not send emissaries to Xerxes offering submission, did not sue for peace on whatever terms they could get, did not accept that the burning of their city meant the end of their resistance, did not calculate that further fighting was pointless when they had already lost what they were fighting to protect. Instead, they prepared for naval battle, gathered their fleet in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, prepared to stake everything on single naval engagement, on the hope that Greek triremes rowed by free citizens would prove superior to Persian ships rowed by impressed crews, on the gamble that destroying the Persian fleet would force Xerxes to withdraw even though his army still controlled the ground, even though Athens was in ruins and Greece seemed defeated. The choice to let Athens burn, to prioritize fleet over fixed city, to value freedom over buildings, to accept total destruction of the city if that was necessary cost of preserving independence, this choice would be vindicated at Salamis, where the Greek fleet would win the victory that changed the war's course, that forced Xerxes to withdraw most of his army back to Asia, that saved Greece from incorporation into the Persian Empire. But standing on Salamis watching Athens burn, before the battle, before the outcome was known, before vindication arrived, the choice must have seemed like desperation rather than strategy, must have felt like the end rather than the beginning, must have tasted like ashes in every survivor's mouth. What does it mean to let your city burn? What does it mean to choose to watch everything you know destroyed rather than to submit, to accept peace that would preserve the buildings at cost of freedom, to save the city by losing the city's independence? The questions are not abstract, are real, are urgent, are questions that Athenians actually faced and answered, are questions that reveal how they understood what mattered, what they valued above life itself, what they would sacrifice to preserve. The modern equivalent might be nuclear war, the choice to fight even when fighting means everything is destroyed, when victory means ruling over ruins, when defending freedom means losing everything that makes freedom worth having. The parallel is imperfect but suggestive, reminds us that sometimes choices are between unacceptable alternatives, that sometimes there is no good option, that sometimes decision is not between right and wrong but between varieties of catastrophe, between losing everything physically or losing everything spiritually, between destruction of city or destruction of soul. The Athenians chose to lose the city rather than to lose their freedom. Would rebuild, would return after Salamis and after Plataea, would clear the rubble and start again, would construct new temples and new walls, would create the Athens that would become cultural center of classical Greece, that would produce Pericles and Socrates and Plato, that would build the Parthenon and establish democracy's most famous example, that would shape Western civilization's political and cultural foundations. But the rebuilding was only possible because they first accepted the burning, because they chose correctly when the choice was between submission and destruction, because they understood that cities are stone but nations are people, that buildings can be rebuilt but freedom once surrendered is rarely recovered. We stand on Salamis looking across the narrow strait toward Athens, imagining the smoke rising, imagining the Acropolis aflame, imagining the emotional devastation of watching home destroyed, of seeing the physical embodiment of identity reduced to ruin, of witnessing the end of the familiar world and the beginning of something uncertain, something that might be defeat and slavery or might be victory and freedom, but that certainly would not be the world that existed before the burning. The strait is calm now, the water reflects the sky, the city across the water is modern Athens, vastly larger than the ancient city, built on and around and over the ruins, layer upon layer of history compressed into the landscape. The ancient city is mostly gone. The Acropolis survives, rebuilt in marble by Pericles' generation, crowned by the Parthenon that replaced the temples Xerxes burned, bearing the weight of 25 centuries of continuous occupation and destruction and rebuilding and meaning. But the city that burned is lost, exists only in archaeology and imagination, in the scattered remains that excavation occasionally uncovers, in the literary sources that describe what was destroyed, in the collective memory that Athens carries of the moment when the city chose to burn rather than to submit. The choice defines Athens perhaps more than any military victory, more than any philosophical achievement, more than any cultural production. It defines what Athens understood itself to be was not buildings or walls or even the Acropolis, was the people and their commitment to freedom, was the willingness to sacrifice everything material to preserve what was essential, was recognition that submission was living death and that physical death was preferable, that losing everything was better than accepting tyranny, that freedom was worth any price, including the price of watching everything burn. We close with image of the last Athenian leaving the city, looking back one final time before descending to the ships, seeing the Acropolis still standing, still crowned with temples that will soon burn, still embodying the city's identity that will soon exist only in memory and in determination to recover what has been lost, to rebuild what has been destroyed, to prove that burning the city was not defeating the nation, that Athens survived in its people rather than in its stone. That freedom was choice rather than condition, was will rather than circumstance, was commitment that could survive any destruction as long as the commitment survived. The city chose to burn. The choice saved Greece. The sacrifice was vindicated. But the moment before vindication, the moment of pure loss, the moment when everything was destroyed and nothing was yet recovered, that moment reveals Athens at its most noble and most desperate, most free and most vulnerable, most worthy of the legend it would become, and most human in the suffering it accepted to preserve what mattered more than comfort or safety or the preservation of beautiful things. Athens burned, but Athens survived. The buildings were lost, but the idea persisted. The city fell, but the nation endured. The fire consumed the past, but the future remained open, and in the narrow strait the fleet waited. The battle approached, the fate of Greece hung in balance, and the burning city became sacrifice that would either prove pointless or would prove to be the price that had to be paid, the loss that had to be accepted, the destruction that had to be endured before victory became possible. The Straits of Salamis are narrow, barely a mile across at their widest point, hemmed by Salamis Island on one side and the Attic coast on the other, by the small island of Citylea in the channel itself, creating confined waters that are more like a large harbor than open ocean, where currents run in unpredictable directions, where winds can shift suddenly, where maneuvering room is limited, and where naval tactics designed for open water become dangerous or impossible. Into these confined waters Xerxes sent his fleet. The decision was forced on him by circumstances and by deception. The Greek fleet had withdrawn to Salamis after Thermopylae, had taken position in the straits where the Persian numerical advantage would be reduced, where Greek knowledge of local waters would give advantage where the terrain favored defense. Xerxes needed to destroy the Greek fleet without naval superiority. He could not maintain supply lines to his army in Greece, could not guarantee safe passage back across the Hellespont, could not risk being trapped in Greece with hostile populations at his rear and winter approaching, and the possibility that Greek resistance would continue indefinitely if the fleet survived. But the Greeks were reluctant to fight, were divided about strategy, were considering withdrawing further south to defend the Peloponnese, abandoning Attica and the northern cities to Persian control. The Peloponnesian commanders wanted to retreat, to build a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth and defend only the southern peninsula, to write off Athens and everything north of the isthmus as lost. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, knew that such a strategy would doom Athens permanently, would leave the Athenians as refugees without hope of returning home, would split the Greek alliance, and would probably lead to defeat in detail as the Peloponnesians found themselves besieged behind their wall, while the Persian fleet controlled the seas around them. So Themistocles sent a secret message to Xerxes, carried by a trusted slave named Sisinus, claiming to betray the Greek position, claiming that the Greek fleet was divided and demoralized, that they were planning to withdraw during the night, that if Xerxes moved quickly, he could trap them in the straits and destroy them before they could escape. The message was false, was designed to provoke Xerxes into fighting in the confined waters where Greek advantages would be greatest, was gamble that Persian confidence and eagerness to finish the war would overcome tactical caution, was manipulation that played on what Themistocles understood about how Xerxes thought and what pressures the great king faced. Xerxes took the bait. He ordered the fleet to enter the straits during the night, to block the exits, to trap the Greek ships, and to attack at dawn when the Greeks would be disorganized and unable to coordinate their response. The Persian fleet, perhaps 600 ships, perhaps 800, sources disagree, but all agree the Persians significantly outnumbered the Greeks, moved into position, filling the narrow waters, creating the exact situation that would prove disastrous. Too many ships in too little space, unable to maneuver, unable to use their superior numbers effectively, crowded together so that when the battle began, disorder would multiply as damaged ships blocked the paths of those behind them, as the organized formation dissolved into chaos. The battle began at dawn. The Greek ships, arranged in line across the strait, waited until the Persian ships were committed, were deep in the confined waters, were packed together and unable to back out easily. Then the Greeks advanced, rowing in perfect unison, maintaining formation, presenting unified front that the disorganized Persians could not match. The Greek triremes, smaller than many Persian ships, more maneuverable, rowed by free citizens fighting for their homes rather than by pressed crews fighting for distant empire, darted among the Persian ships, rammed them, disabled them, created cascading disaster as damaged vessels collided with others, as formations broke apart, as the Persian advantage in numbers became crushing liability. Xerxes watched from a golden throne positioned on Mount Aegaleo, on the slope overlooking the straits where he could observe the battle, where he had scribes recording the names of commanders who fought bravely so they could be rewarded later, where he expected to witness the destruction of the Greek fleet and the completion of his conquest. Instead, he watched disaster unfold, watched as ship after ship was disabled or sunk, watched as the Persian fleet was destroyed not through Greek superiority in individual combat, though that helped, but through tactical situation that made Persian numbers irrelevant and Greek knowledge of local waters decisive. The Phoenician ships, the core of the Persian fleet, bore the brunt of the losses. When they tried to withdraw, tried to escape the trap they had sailed into, Xerxes reportedly ordered some of their commanders executed for cowardice, not understanding or not accepting that the disaster was not due to cowardice, but to having been led into tactical situation where defeat was nearly inevitable, where only retreat could save what remained of the fleet. The executions, if they happened, the account comes from Greek sources that may have invented or exaggerated reveal Xerxes's position, could not accept that his strategy had failed, could not acknowledge that Greek deception had outmaneuvered him, could only understand defeat as somebody's failure to execute his brilliant plan rather than as result of the plan being flawed. The battle lasted hours, but the outcome was clear by midday. The Persian fleet was shattered, not completely destroyed, but badly mauled, no longer capable of controlling the seas around Greece, no longer able to guarantee supply lines or prevent Greek counterattacks or maintain the naval superiority that the invasion required. The Greeks lost ships to perhaps 40 of their roughly 370 triremes, but lost proportionally much less than the Persians' maintained functional fleet, proved that they could fight and win, demonstrated that Persian power had limits and that those limits had been reached. The strategic implications were immediate and catastrophic for Xerxes. With the fleet crippled, the massive army in Greece became vulnerable. Supply lines across the Hellespont were no longer secure if Greeks could interdict supplies or if autumn storms prevented shipping, the army could starve. The route back to Asia was threatened if Greeks controlled the Hellespont crossings, the army could be trapped in Europe, could be cut off from reinforcement and resupply, could be ground down by Greek harassment while winter approached and food supplies dwindled. The invasion's timeline, already tight, became impossible. Victory had to come before winter or retreat became necessary, and Salamis made quick victory unlikely. Xerxes made the only decision he could make: he would withdraw. Not immediately, not in panicked flight, but in organized retreat that would preserve most of the army while acknowledging that the invasion had failed, that Greece would not be conquered this year, that the massive force that had crossed into Europe would not complete its mission. He left a substantial force under his general Mardonius, perhaps 80,000 men, perhaps more, to continue the land campaign, to maintain Persian presence in Greece, to try to salvage something from the disaster. But Xerxes himself departed, took the bulk of his forces back to Asia, back across the Hellespont that he had bridged with such confidence, back to an empire that would hear of defeat rather than triumph, back to a legacy that would be defined by the invasion that failed rather than by the empire he had maintained. The retreat was not rout. The Persian army was still formidable, still dangerous, still capable of devastating Greece if it chose to stay and fight. The withdrawal was orderly, was strategic decision based on recognition that continuing the invasion without naval superiority was too risky, that losing the entire army was worse than admitting defeat and withdrawing to fight another day. Mardonius's force that remained would be defeated the following year at Plataea, would be destroyed by Greek heavy infantry in battle that confirmed what Thermopylae and Salamis had suggested, that Greek hoplites were superior to Persian troops in direct combat, that Persian Empire had reached its western limit, that Greece would remain independent. We stand at the strait watching the sunset paint the waters gold, imagining the battle fought here, the desperate Greek courage and Persian confusion, the narrow passage that became turning point not just in war but in history, the moment when East met West and West prevailed, when democracy's rough vigor proved stronger than empire's organized might, when the course of Western civilization was set in directions that would lead through Athens's golden age to Rome to medieval Europe to the modern world. If Persia had won at Salamis, if the Greek fleet had been destroyed, if Xerxes had conquered Greece, the entire subsequent history of Western civilization would have been different in ways we cannot begin to imagine. And perhaps the West would have been better, perhaps Persian tolerance and administrative sophistication would have created more just and more prosperous world than the conflict-ridden Greek city-states managed. Perhaps the empire's unity would have prevented the warfare that exhausted Greece. Perhaps Persian preservation of local cultures would have enriched rather than impoverished the Greek heritage. Or perhaps the West would never have developed the particular characteristics democracy, philosophy, scientific inquiry, individual rights that we associate with Western civilization. Perhaps those characteristics depended on Greek independence. Perhaps submission to Persian authority would have changed Greek culture in ways that prevented its flowering, that stopped it from producing Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, that ended the democratic experiment before it could influence later ages. The counterfactual speculation is endless and ultimately pointless. What happened is what happened. The Greeks won at Salamis, Xerxes withdrew, the invasion failed, Greece remained independent. The sea swallowed the Persian attempt at expansion, the narrow waters became graveyard for imperial ambitions, the tide turned literally and metaphorically as Persian fortunes ebbed and Greek survival became Greek triumph. But we must acknowledge that Salamis was not inevitable Greek victory any more than Thermopylae was inevitable Persian victory. Was result of specific tactical decisions Themistocles' deception, Xerxes' acceptance of that deception, the Greeks' knowledge of local waters, the Persians' crowding in the confined space, the courage and discipline of Greek rowers, the confusion and poor command on the Persian side. Change any of these factors and the outcome might have been different, the turning point might not have turned. the empire might have swallowed Greece as it had swallowed so many others. The contingency is important, reminds us that history is not predetermined, that outcomes depend on human choices and chance and countless small factors that we can identify only afterward, that great events have causes but causes do not guarantee effects, that what seems inevitable in retrospect was uncertain when it happened. Salamis was Greek victory but was also Persian blunder, was Themistocles' brilliance but was also Xerxes' error, was terrain's effect but was also human choices that put forces in that terrain and determined how they fought there. We close with the waters calm, the battle long over, the strait peaceful and ordinary, tourist boats passing where triremes once rammed each other, modern shipping using channels that ancient navies fought to control, the site of the turning point now anonymous, marked by no monument visible from the sea, remembered more in books and imaginations than in the physical landscape where it happened. The sea remembers, but the sea is silent, reveals nothing of the violence it once witnessed, shows no trace of the ships that sank or the men who drowned or the empire whose ambitions foundered in these narrow waters. But the silence is eloquent, the absence is testimony. What is not here the Persian Empire extending to Greece, the alternative history where East absorbed West, the world that might have been if Salamis had gone differently? This absence shapes everything that is here, defines the world we inherit, determines the civilization we know. Salamis the battle, Salamis the turning point, Salamis the place where the sea swallowed an empire and spat out the beginning of what would become Western civilization, the victory that preserved Greek independence and thereby preserved the possibility of everything that Greek culture would contribute to the world. The strait is narrow. The water flows, the sun sets. And somewhere in the depths, the wreckage of Persian ships rests, testimony to ambition that overreached, to power that found its limit, to empire that discovered that some things cannot be conquered, that some peoples will not submit, that even the great kings will has boundaries, and those boundaries are determined not by what the king commands but by what circumstances allow and what opponents refuse to accept. A Persepolis rises from the plain like a vision, like a dream made stone, like the empire itself translated into architecture that seems to defy both gravity and time. The approach reveals it gradually. First, the platform, massive terrace built from enormous limestone blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, raised 40 feet above the plain to lift the palace above floods and dust storms and the common earth. Then the double staircase, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, ascending in gentle grade that allowed dignitaries to climb without losing dignity, carved with processions of tribute-bearers from every nation under Persian rule, each figure carrying gifts that symbolized their land: gold from Lydia, horses from Armenia, camels from Arabia, tribute that demonstrated the reach of Persian power and the submission of conquered nations. At the top of the stairs, the gate of all nations, massive portal with human-headed winged bulls flanking the entrance, protective spirits borrowed from Assyrian tradition, guardian figures whose fierce faces and powerful bodies announced that beyond this threshold lay the center of the world, the place where all peoples met, where the great king received delegations and dispensed justice and embodied the empire's unity and diversity. The bull's wings suggest divine protection, their human heads suggest wisdom and intelligence applied to power, their bodies suggest strength that cannot be overcome. The symbolism is deliberate, is theological statement about kingship's nature, about how authority derives from divine sanction and human capability working together. Beyond the gate lies the Apodana, the great audience hall where Xerxes received ambassadors and tribute-bearers, where New Year festivals brought representatives from every satrapy to renew their loyalty and present gifts that renewed the relationship between center and periphery, between the great king and the nations that acknowledged his sovereignty. The hall is forest of columns 7-2 originally, each 6 to 5 feet tall, creating space that is enclosed yet feels open, that is clearly built yet seems to grow organically from the earth, that transforms stone into something almost weightless, almost living, almost defying the mass and solidity that makes it stand. The columns are marvels. Fluted shafts rise from bell-shaped bases, topped by double-bull capitals whose inverted bodies support the massive cedar beams that once held the roof, whose horns and shoulders and haunches carry weight that seems impossible for stone animals to bear. The capitals are sculptures, are works of art, are demonstrations of technical skill and aesthetic vision that transforms structural necessity into beauty, that makes the functional into the sublime, that proves that empire's power could create not just military might and administrative efficiency, but genuine art, authentic beauty, architecture that inspires awe not through size alone but through proportion and detail, and the sense that every element serves both practical and symbolic purposes. The reliefs covering the staircases and walls show the empire's diversity, contained and displayed procession of tribute-bearers ascending toward the king, each group dressed in their national costumes, each carrying gifts distinctive to their homeland, each representing a people who had submitted to Persian authority but who maintained their identity, who brought what made them unique as offering to the universal sovereign. Medes and Persians in their robes and tiaras, Elamites carrying lion cubs, Armenians leading horses, Bactrians with camels, Indians with gold dust, Ethiopians with ivory tusks, Arabs with frankincense. The procession includes representatives from every corner of the empire, demonstrates the reach of Persian power, proclaims the vision of universal empire that contains rather than erases difference. But the reliefs also show the king, shown repeatedly in various contexts, seated on throne receiving tribute, standing in audience granting petitions, fighting lions in ritual hunt that demonstrated royal courage, protected by parasol-bearer and fly-whisk attendant whose presence proclaimed the king's exalted status, accompanied by guards whose identical faces and postures suggest not individuals but roles, not persons but functions that serve to protect and honor the great king's person. The king is always shown larger than other figures, always central to compositions, always the focus toward which everything else directs attention and deference. The message is clear. The great king is supreme, is focus of all loyalty, is source of all authority, is person whose will determines the empire's course and whose favor determines individuals' fates. But the message is also subtle. The king is shown receiving rather than taking, is shown surrounded by willing supporters rather than by cowed slaves, is shown as rightful ruler whose authority is acknowledged rather than as tyrant whose power is feared. The propaganda is sophisticated, presents empire as based on consent, albeit consent that had little choice rather than on naked force, presents Persian rule as natural order rather than as imposed tyranny. Xerxes added to Persepolis what his father Darius had begun, completed the Apadana that Darius had started, built additional palaces and treasury buildings, left inscriptions proclaiming his work. Says Xerxes the king, by the favor of Ahura Mazda this gateway of all lands I built. Much else that is beautiful was built within this palace which I built and which my father built. Whatever seems beautiful we have built, all that by the favor of Ahura Mazda. The words reveal Xerxes's understanding of his role. He was completing his father's vision, was finishing what Darius began, was maintaining and elaborating the architectural expression of empire's ideology. But Persepolis was never primary capital, was never administrative center where daily governance occurred. Susa and Babylon and Ecbatana were working capitals where the great king spent most of his time, where bureaucracy functioned, where records were kept and orders issued and the machinery of empire operated. Persepolis was ceremonial capital, was ideological center, was place where empire's vision was made visible, where the New Year festival called Nowruz brought representatives from every satrapy to participate in rituals that renewed the cosmic and political order, that reaffirmed the great king's role as maintainer of truth and order against chaos and falsehood. The New Year festival was both religious ceremony and political theater. It was celebration of spring equinox, of the moment when day and night are equal length, when the balance tips toward light and warmth and growth, when winter's death gives way to spring's resurrection. Was theological statement about cosmic order, about the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, about how the forces of truth and light prevail over darkness and chaos through the great king's maintenance of justice and order. It was political demonstration of empire's unity, of the great king's universal sovereignty, of the willing submission of all peoples to Persian authority. The tribute-bearers ascending the stairs were not conquered peoples bringing forced payment, but were in the ceremony's ideology at least willing participants in cosmic order, were bringing gifts rather than tribute, were acknowledging the great king's role in maintaining the world's proper functioning, were contributing their nation's unique products to the universal sovereign who protected them all. The distinction between tribute and gifts is semantic but significant, reveals how Persian ideology understood empire not as domination, but as reciprocal relationship where subjects received protection and justice in exchange for acknowledging sovereignty and contributing to the whole. Whether the subject peoples accepted this ideology is questionable. Whether they saw themselves as willing participants or as conquered peoples making the best of submission is unknowable from the sources that survive. The inscriptions and reliefs present only the official view, only how the empire wanted to be seen, only the propaganda rather than the reality. But propaganda can reveal truth even when it distorts reality. The very fact that Persians felt the need to present empire as based on consent rather than force, as protecting diversity rather than imposing uniformity, as reciprocal relationship rather than naked domination, suggests that these values mattered, that Persian ideology distinguished itself from simple tyranny, that the empire's self-understanding involved more than might-making right. We walk through the Apadana as twilight settles, as shadows fill the spaces between columns, as the forest of stone pillars creates patterns of light and dark that shift with the sun's movement, that transform the hall throughout the day, that make the space seem alive, seem responsive, seem to breathe with the changing light. The roof is gone, burned by Alexander's army in 330 BCE. Whether deliberately or accidentally, sources disagree, destroyed in conflagration that ended the Achaemenid dynasty and marked the transition from Persian to Greek dominance, from Eastern to Western imperial power. But the columns stand, rise still toward empty sky, still proclaim the vision that Darius and Xerxes built, still testify to empire's ambition and achievement. The stone has survived 23 centuries of earthquakes and weather and human vandalism, has outlasted the empire it was built to glorify, has become ruins that tourists visit and archaeologists study, that represent the past to modern Iran, that connect contemporary Iranians to pre-Islamic heritage, that provide continuity across millennia of conquest and cultural transformation. The inscriptions Xerxes left are in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, using 3 different scripts, addressing 3 different audiences, proclaiming the same message in tongues that the empire's diverse peoples could read. The trilingual inscriptions demonstrate administrative sophistication, show recognition that empire governing such diversity needed to communicate in multiple languages, that imposing single official language would create problems, that allowing linguistic diversity while maintaining political unity was practical necessity as well as ideological commitment. The Elamite texts are most numerous. Elamite was administrative language, language of the scribes who kept records, who managed the bureaucracy, who wrote the clay tablets that detailed everything from food rations to construction costs. The Babylonian texts addressed Mesopotamian population, wrote in cuneiform script that had been used for 3,000 years when Xerxes inscribed it at Persepolis, connected Persian Empire to ancient Near Eastern traditions, proclaimed continuity with Babylonian and Assyrian empires that had ruled before Persians unified the region. The Old Persian texts were newest, were script invented under Darius to write the Persian language, were used primarily for royal inscriptions, for proclamations meant to last eternally in stone. The linguistic diversity mirrors the empire's ethnic and cultural diversity, demonstrates the policy of tolerance within submission, shows how Persians governed by acknowledging difference while requiring unity, by allowing local languages and customs while insisting on political loyalty, by preserving identities while transforming them into components of larger whole. The policy was pragmatic more than principled was recognition that forcing uniformity on territories stretching from the Indus to the Aegean was impossible, that working with existing structures and authorities was more efficient than trying to impose Persian structures everywhere. But pragmatism can create positive outcomes even when motives are not purely altruistic. The tolerance, however motivated, allowed subject peoples to maintain their identities across centuries of Persian rule, allowed languages and religions and cultural traditions to persist that might have been lost under more aggressively assimilationist empire, created diversity that enriched rather than impoverished the empire, that made it stronger through its variety rather than weaker through its fragmentation. We close standing in the center of the Apadana, surrounded by columns that rise toward stars now visible in darkening sky, feeling the weight of what was built here, the vision of empire that could contain the world's diversity, the dream that all peoples might dwell in peace under universal sovereign, the architecture that transformed ideology into stone, that made abstract political theory into concrete reality that could be walked through and experienced and remembered. The palace of endless columns. The hall where nations met. The ceremonial center of empire that stretched beyond sight in every direction, that seemed to be the world itself, that contained such diversity and such power that its fall seemed unimaginable until Alexander came and the empire fell and the palace burned and the columns stood empty beneath the stars, testifying to achievement and to impermanence, to what humans can build and to what time and conquest inevitably destroy. There is an inscription at Persepolis, words Xerxes had carved into stone that still stand legible after 23 centuries, that proclaim a vision that seems remarkably modern, that speaks to aspirations that transcend the ancient world's typical celebration of conquest and domination. The inscription reads, Ahura Mazda is a great god who created this earth, who created that sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Xerxes king, one king of many, one lord of many. The theology is clear. Ahura Mazda created everything, including humans, created happiness as human destiny, made Xerxes king to ensure that humans could achieve the happiness that God intended for them. The vision embedded in these words is of universal order, of divine mandate that extends beyond national or tribal boundaries, of sovereignty that encompasses all peoples because all peoples are creations of the same God, all deserving of the same protection and the same justice under the great king's rule. The empire is not presented as conquest imposed through force, but as fulfillment of divine plan, as means through which God's intention for human happiness is realized, as structure that protects and orders rather than merely dominates. The theology derived from Zoroastrianism, that Persian religion that understood cosmos as battleground between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord who represents truth and order and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit who represents falsehood and chaos and darkness. A human life is participation in this cosmic struggle. Every choice between truth and lie, between order and chaos, between creative action and destructive negation, is taking sides in war that transcends individual existence. That began before humans existed and will continue until the final renovation when Ahura Mazda triumphs and evil is destroyed forever, and the world is restored to its originally intended perfection. The great king's role in this theology is crucial, is earthly representative of Ahura Mazda's truth and order, is the person who maintains justice and fights against chaos, who creates conditions where humans can flourish and achieve the happiness that Ahura Mazda intended. To resist the great king is therefore to ally with Angra Mainyu, to choose chaos over order, to work against divine plan for human welfare. And to submit to the great king is to acknowledge truth, to participate in cosmic order, to receive protection and justice that allow humans to pursue happiness in ways that isolated tribal existence or constant warfare between competing peoples would prevent. The ideology justified empire but also constrained it. If the great king was Ahura Mazda's representative, then he was obligated to govern according to truth and justice, to protect the righteous and punish the wicked, to maintain order that benefited subjects rather than merely extracting resources for rulers' benefit. The theological framework created expectations about how the great king should rule, created standards against which his governance could be measured, created basis for criticism when rulers failed to meet the obligations that their exalted position imposed. The vision was never fully realized, no vision ever is, but it shaped how Persian Empire functioned in ways that distinguished it from simple tyranny, in ways that made it genuinely more tolerant and more just than many empires before or since. The religious tolerance that allowed Jews to return from Babylonian exile and rebuild their temple, that allowed Egyptians to worship their gods and maintain their temples, that allowed diverse peoples to maintain their religions and their cultural practices. This tolerance was not merely pragmatic accommodation, but was theological commitment, was recognition that Ahura Mazda created all humans and therefore all deserved protection and justice regardless of which gods they worshipped or which languages they spoke. The administrative systems that Persians developed reflected this vision. The satrapy system that divided empire into provinces, each governed by satrap who had considerable autonomy within his region, allowed for local administration that could respond to local needs and customs, that could maintain continuity with pre-Persian governing structures, that could preserve the illusion and sometimes the reality that local elites still governed their own peoples while acknowledging Persian overlordship. The system was efficient, was sustainable across vast territories, was flexible enough to accommodate enormous diversity while maintaining sufficient central control to keep the empire unified. The royal road that connected Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in Persia was not just military highway but was trade route, was communication system, was physical manifestation of empire that united rather than divided, that made distant regions accessible to each other, that allowed goods and ideas and people to move across territories that had previously been isolated. The road was engineering achievement, 1,600 miles of maintained highway with rest stations every 15 miles, with fresh horses available for royal messengers, with infrastructure that enabled messages to travel from one end of empire to the other in a week, a speed not surpassed until the invention of telegraph 2 millennia later. The postal system that operated along the royal road was administrative innovation that enabled effective governance across impossible distances. Herodotus wrote admiringly, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds," words that would later be inscribed on the New York City post office. Testimony to how Persian innovations influenced even modern institutions, how the dream of reliable communication across vast distances continues to shape how empires and nations function. But the dream contained contradictions that Xerxes either did not recognize or chose to ignore. Universal peace required universal submission. The tolerance extended only to those who accepted Persian sovereignty. Those who resisted faced destruction. The justice was real but was imposed from above, was not democratic or participatory, assumed that the great king knew what was best for all peoples regardless of what those peoples desired for themselves. The infrastructure benefited everyone but also facilitated control, made rebellion more difficult, allowed Persian armies to move quickly to trouble spots, served empire's purposes even when it served subjects' needs. The invasion of Greece revealed these contradictions starkly. The Greeks rejected the premise that Persian rule would bring them happiness, rejected the claim that submitting to the great king was acknowledging cosmic order, insisted that their freedom, not the order that Persians offered, was what made human happiness possible. The conflict was not merely military but was ideological, was clash between two fundamentally different visions of how humans should organize themselves politically and what values should guide that organization. Xerxes could not understand Greek resistance, could not comprehend why they would choose warfare and destruction over the peace and prosperity that Persian rule offered, could not accept that Greeks preferred their chaotic independence to Persian order, that they valued their freedom defined as autonomy to govern themselves however badly more than they valued the security and justice that empire promised. The incomprehension was mutual. Greeks could not understand why anyone would submit to absolute monarchy, could not imagine that subjects of the great king might genuinely prefer Persian rule to the constant warfare between Greek city-states, could not accept that order and peace might be worth the price of political submission. The dream of universal peace under Persian rule was genuine dream, was vision of world unified and prosperous, of Pax Persica comparable to later Pax Romana, of empire that protected all peoples and allowed all to flourish within framework of order that prevented the chaos of constant conflict. But dreams dreamed by emperors are different from dreams dreamed by those they rule. One person's order is another's oppression. One people's peace is another's conquest. One vision of happiness is another's nightmare. The dream was sincere but was also self-serving, was theology that justified empire but was developed by the empire to justify itself, was ideology that explained why Persian domination was good for everyone even when those being dominated disagreed violently. We sit with these contradictions, resist simple judgments, acknowledge that empire brought genuine benefits, roads and communications, protection from warfare, tolerance of diversity, administrative efficiency, legal structures that provided justice however imperfect, while also acknowledging that these benefits came at cost of freedom, came through conquest, came with submission that many peoples resented and resisted and eventually overthrew. The vision of universal peace was noble, the means were questionable, the results were mixed, the legacy is ambiguous. The dream endures in the inscriptions, in the ruins of Persepolis, in the memory of what was attempted even when we acknowledge what was imposed. We close contemplating whether universal peace is possible, whether diverse peoples can be unified without force, whether empire is inherent evil or can be organized justly, whether the choice is between chaotic freedom and orderly submission, or whether some third way might combine the best of both: freedom within order, diversity within unity, autonomy within cooperation, peace without empire's compulsion. The questions have no final answers, persist across centuries, remain urgent as modern world wrestles with similar problems: how to organize global society, how to maintain peace while respecting sovereignty, how to address problems that transcend borders while preserving local autonomy, how to create order without tyranny, unity without uniformity, cooperation without conquest. Xerxes's dream failed, the empire fell, the vision proved unsustainable. But the questions remain, the problems persist, the need for answers continues. The dream of universal peace, the vision of world unified, the hope that humans might find way to live together without constant conflict, without endless warfare, without the choice between isolation and domination. The dream that Xerxes dreamed in stone at Persepolis, forever noble, forever flawed, forever calling us to imagine better, to try again, to seek the peace that empire promised but could not deliver. In the Zoroastrian tradition that shaped Persian culture and imperial ideology, fire is sacred, is not mere element, not simple tool for cooking and warmth, but is manifestation of divine truth, is Ahura Mazda's presence made visible in the material world, is light that drives away darkness, both literal and spiritual, both physical and metaphorical. The fire temples that Persians built across their empire, the flames that burned continuously within them, the rituals performed by magi who tended the sacred fires, all testified to religion that saw cosmos as fundamental dualism, as eternal struggle between truth and lie, between order and chaos, between the light of righteous thought and the darkness of destructive impulse. The sacred fire Atar in Avestan, the language of Zoroastrian scripture was not worshipped as God itself, but was honored as symbol and manifestation of Ahura Mazda's truth, was presence of the divine in material form, was reminder that the cosmic struggle between light and darkness was not abstract theology, but was immediate reality visible in the flames that consumed fuel and gave light and heat, that transformed matter into energy. That demonstrated the creative power that Ahura Mazda embodied, and that humans were called to participate in through righteous thought, righteous speech, and righteous action. The fire temples were simple, were not elaborate architectural monuments like Greek temples or ziggurats, were often just chambers containing fire altars where flames burned continuously, where magi performed rituals 5 times daily, where the faithful came to pray but not to worship the fire itself, came to stand in presence of divine manifestation but not to bow to the flames. The simplicity was deliberate. Zoroastrianism emphasized truth over show, substance over appearance, inner righteousness over external ritual, and the fire temple's simplicity reflected this emphasis, avoided the monumental grandeur that might distract from the sacred fire's meaning. Xerxes was Zoroastrian, believed in Ahura Mazda's sovereignty, saw his own rule as participation in cosmic struggle to maintain truth and order against falsehood and chaos. The religious conviction shaped his kingship, gave theological weight to imperial policy, transformed conquest from mere political expansion into religious duty, bringing order to Greek chaos, extending truth into regions where falsehood reigned, imposing Ahura Mazda's will on peoples who didn't know they needed it. The theology justified the invasion of Greece, explained why Greek resistance was not merely political opposition but was spiritual rebellion, was alliance with forces of chaos and darkness, was choice of lie over truth that had to be corrected through conquest. But the religion also imposed constraints, created expectations about how the great king should rule, established standards against which his governance would be judged by God if not by subjects. Zoroastrian ethics emphasized truth-telling. Lying was fundamental sin, was alliance with Angra was corruption at the root that poisoned everything that grew from it. The great king was expected to speak truth, to govern justly, to protect the righteous and punish the wicked, to maintain cosmic order through earthly justice. The expectations were not always met. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and no ideology can fully prevent rulers from abusing authority, but the expectations existed nonetheless, created framework for criticism, provided basis for resistance when rulers violated the principles they claimed to embody. The religion's emphasis on individual moral responsibility distinguished it from the more fatalistic religious traditions of the ancient Near East. In Zoroastrianism, humans were not pawns of capricious gods, were not victims of fate they could not control, were free agents whose choices mattered cosmically, whose decisions to align with truth or with falsehood affected not just their own fates but the cosmic struggle's outcome. Every lie told strengthened Angra, every truth spoken strengthened Ahura Mazda, every just action advanced order, every unjust action advanced chaos. The individual mattered, the choices mattered, the moral life mattered in ways that transcended immediate consequences and contributed to ultimate cosmic outcome. The eschatology promised final victory for truth over lie, for order over chaos, for Ahura Mazda over Angra Mainyu. The world was moving toward renovation, toward frashocracy, when evil would be finally defeated, when the dead would be resurrected and judged, when the righteous would live eternally in perfected world, and the wicked would be destroyed or purified, when everything would be restored to the originally intended perfection that existed before Angra Mainyu corrupted creation. The promise gave meaning to suffering, gave hope in face of injustice, gave assurance that evil's apparent triumphs were temporary, that cosmic arc bent toward justice even when immediate circumstances suggested otherwise. The religion influenced Judaism during the Babylonian exile and Persian period concepts of heaven and hell, of final judgment, of resurrection of the dead, of cosmic dualism between good and evil all appear in later Jewish texts and may reflect Zoroastrian influence, may show how Persian religion affected Jewish theology during centuries when Jews lived under Persian rule. The influence extended to Christianity and Islam through Judaism meant that Zoroastrian concepts became foundational to all three Abrahamic religions, shaped how billions of humans across millennia have understood morality and afterlife and cosmic meaning. But Zoroastrianism itself declined after Islam's conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE. The religion that had been Persian Empire's official faith became minority tradition, persecuted under some Muslim rulers, tolerated under others, gradually reduced from majority religion to small communities maintaining ancient practices in changed circumstances. The Parsis who fled to India to escape persecution, the Zoroastrians who remained in Iran despite conversion pressures, these communities preserved traditions across 14 centuries of Islamic rule, maintained rituals and beliefs and sacred fires through generations when the religion seemed doomed to extinction. The survival testifies to commitment that transcends political power, to faith that persists despite losing state support, to communities that value continuity more than they value comfort or worldly success. The sacred fires that burned in ancient fire temples still burn in Parsi and Zoroastrian temples today, tended by priests who trace their lineages back across centuries, who perform rituals essentially unchanged from what Magi performed in Xerxes's time, who keep alive the religion that shaped Persian imperial ideology and influenced the great monotheistic traditions. We stand before a sacred fire in a modern fire temple, could be in Yazd in Iran where Zoroastrian community persists, could be in Mumbai where Parsi community maintains tradition. Location matters less than the continuity, than the connection across 25 centuries from Xerxes's time to our own. The fire burns as fires have always burned, consumes fuel and gives light and heat, demonstrates transformation of matter into energy, embodies the creative power that Zoroastrianism identified with ultimate divine reality. The flames flicker, casting moving shadows that create sense of life, of presence, of something beyond the merely physical. The Magi tend the fire with care that comes from long practice, that embodies reverence without superstition, that honors without worshipping, that recognizes the fire as sacred symbol while understanding it as natural phenomenon. The balance is subtle, neither reducing the sacred to mere matter nor elevating matter to improper divinity, neither denying the spiritual meaning nor losing sight of physical reality. The continuity connects us to Xerxes, to the great king who ruled empire and who prayed before similar fires, who understood his power as derived from Ahura Mazda and his duty as maintaining cosmic order, who built palaces and invaded Greece and was assassinated by his own guards, but who believed throughout that he was doing God's work, that his reign was participation in cosmic struggle, that his choices mattered eternally and not just politically. Whether he was right, whether his theology was true, whether his God exists, these questions cannot be answered definitively, remain matters of faith rather than proof, remain questions that each person must answer for themselves. But the fire burns regardless of whether we believe, burns as it has burned for millennia, burns as it will continue burning as long as communities exist to tend it. As long as the tradition persists, as long as humans find meaning in symbols that connect present to past, that link individual lives to cosmic purposes, that suggest that existence means something beyond survival and pleasure, that there are truths worth preserving and passing forward even when preservation requires sacrifice. Even when the world has changed beyond recognition, even when the empire that once protected the religion has fallen and the faith that once commanded millions is maintained by thousands. We close with image of the fire reflected in faces watching it, with the play of light and shadow across generations gathered in the temple, with the sense of continuity that transcends individual lives, that connects present to past through the sacred flame that has been passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation, from age to age, never allowed to die, always tended, always preserved. Always carrying meaning that those who tend it may understand differently than their ancestors did, but that they nonetheless recognize as worth maintaining, worth protecting, worth passing to those who will come after them. The fire that would not die, the flame that persists. The sacred symbol that connects Xerxes to us across 25 centuries, across the fall of his empire and the rise and fall of others, across cultural transformations and religious conversions and the sweeping changes that make the ancient world seem impossibly distant. Yet the fire burns, the tradition continues. The questions Zoroastrianism asked about truth and lie, about order and chaos, about how humans should live and what gives life meaning, these questions remain urgent, remain unanswered, remain calling us to choose between truth and falsehood, between creation and destruction, between light and darkness. The fire burns. And in its light we see not just flames but the accumulated wisdom of ages, the persistent human seeking for meaning, the refusal to accept that material existence is all there is, the insistence that there must be more, that truth exists, that our choices matter, that the cosmic struggle between good and evil is real and that we participate in it through every decision we make. The fire that would not die, forever burning, forever calling. A forever reminding us that some things are sacred, some truths are eternal, some flames must never be allowed to go out. Xerxes died in his bed, not on battlefield in glory of conquest, not facing enemies with sword in hand as warrior king should die, but in his palace in Persepolis in the night, killed by those who should have protected him, betrayed by trust, murdered by proximity. The assassin was Artabanus, commander of the royal guard, official who had served Xerxes for years, who knew the palace's secret passages and the guard's rotation schedules, who could approach the great king's bedchamber without raising suspicion, who had access and opportunity that only the most trusted possessed. The murder was political conspiracy, was calculated attempt to seize power by eliminating the king and his designated heir, was plot that relied on careful timing and insider knowledge and the conspirators' ability to control what happened immediately after the assassination, to shape the narrative, to place their preferred candidate on throne before opposition could organize resistance. Artabanus killed Xerxes and then killed or attempted to kill Darius, the crown prince, the eldest son who should have succeeded automatically, the heir whose survival would doom the conspiracy because legitimate succession would precede and conspirators would be executed as traitors. But the conspiracy failed. The sources disagree on details. Some say Darius survived the assassination attempt and rallied forces loyal to him. Others say Darius died, but his younger brother Artaxerxes discovered the plot and defeated the conspirators. Still others suggest more complex scenarios involving multiple factions and shifting alliances and violence that nearly tore the empire apart before legitimate succession was finally established. What's clear is that Artabanus failed, that the conspiracy was discovered or defeated, that Artaxerxes, Xerxes's third son, became king and executed the conspirators and re-established stability. The manner of Xerxes's death, murdered by his own guard commander in his own palace, stands in stark contrast to the image of invincible emperor, of great king whose word was law and whose person was sacred, of absolute monarch whose power seemed unlimited and whose authority seemed unchallengeable. The gap between ideology and reality, between how power presents itself and how it actually functions, becomes visible in the assassination, proves that imperial authority was always fragile, always dependent on others' cooperation and loyalty, always one betrayal away from dissolution, always vulnerable to those closest to the center, to those who had access and trust and the capacity to strike before defenses could respond. The irony is profound. Xerxes, who commanded millions, who bridged continents with ships lashed together, who ordered the sea whipped for disobedience, who burned Athens and ruled territories stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, this man died helpless in his bed, killed by someone he trusted, unable to prevent the knife that ended his reign and his life, unable to protect himself despite all the guards and elaborate security that supposedly made the great king invulnerable. Power could not save him. Authority could not protect him. The empire that seemed so mighty could not prevent one determined man with access from ending everything. The assassination reveals palace politics' brutal realities, shows how dangerous proximity to power was, how those closest to the king were both most privileged and most at risk, how trust was weapon as much as shield, how loyalty could be performance concealing betrayal, how the most trusted officials were potentially the most dangerous because they had access that others lacked, knowledge that others didn't possess, opportunities that others could not exploit. The great king lived surrounded by people who might kill him, ate food that might be poisoned, slept in chambers that might hide assassins, trusted guards who might be conspirators, relied on officials who might betray him. The paranoia that absolute power creates is not irrational, is realistic response to genuine danger, is recognition that anyone with access could be threat, that apparent loyalty might conceal calculation, that smiles might mask hostility, that the price of absolute power is absolute vulnerability to those who share that power's proximity. The great kings responded to this danger through elaborate precautions: food tasters who ate before the king to detect poison, guards who guarded the guards who guarded the king, officials who watched officials who watched officials, systems of surveillance and counter-surveillance that attempted to prevent betrayal through creating mutual suspicion and constant monitoring. But no system could eliminate the danger completely. Someone had to have access. Someone had to be trusted. And anyone trusted could betray that trust. The conspiracy that killed Xerxes succeeded precisely because Artabanus was trusted, because he had legitimate access to the king's chambers, because his presence would not raise alarms, because the guards who should have protected Xerxes answered to Artabanus, because the system designed to protect the king could be turned against him by someone who controlled key positions within that system. The death raises questions about Xerxes's reign, about what he accomplished and what he failed to accomplish, about how history should remember him. He is remembered primarily for the invasion of Greece, for the defeat at Salamis, for the retreat that ended Persian expansion westward, for the failure that marked the limit of Persian power. The Greek sources that provide most of our information about Xerxes portray him negatively as tyrant, as barbarian, as arrogant fool who thought he could conquer Greece, who whipped the sea and bridged the Hellespont and led the vast multinational army to humiliating defeat at the hands of a few thousand Greeks fighting for their freedom. But the Greek portrayal is propaganda, is Victor's narrative written by those who defeated Xerxes and who needed him to be villain, to be the tyrant against whom Greek freedom was defended, to be the barbarian whose defeat proved Greek superiority. The real Xerxes was more complex, was competent administrator who maintained the empire his father built, was builder who completed Persepolis and created architectural wonders, was religious person who took seriously his role as Ahura Mazda's representative, was king who faced impossible challenges and made reasonable decisions given the information available and the constraints he operated under. The invasion of Greece was not vanity project or mad quest for glory, was strategic necessity, was attempt to eliminate threat on the empire's western frontier, was response to Greek interference in Persian territories during the Ionian Revolt, was effort to complete the conquest that Darius had begun and had failed to finish. The decision to invade was reasonable given what Xerxes knew, given the assumption that the massive force he assembled would overwhelm Greek resistance as it had overwhelmed every other opponent, given the expectation that Greeks would submit as Egyptians and Babylonians, and so many others had submitted when faced with Persian might. The defeat was not due to Xerxes's incompetence, but to circumstances he could not control, to Greek determination to resist regardless of odds, to tactical decisions like Themistocles' deception that lured the Persian fleet into confined waters at Salamis, to geography that favored defenders at Thermopylae and in the narrow straits where numbers mattered less than position and maneuverability, and to logistics that imposed timeline that didn't allow for the patient siege warfare that might have eventually broken Greek resistance. Xerxes made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, accepted bad intelligence, underestimated Greek capabilities, but the mistakes were human errors, were the kinds of misjudgments that any commander might make, were not evidence of fundamental incompetence or of the arrogance and folly that Greek sources attributed to him. The reign that followed the Greek defeat was not ignominious failure, was continued governance of the empire, was maintenance of the systems Darius had established, was building projects and administrative work and religious devotion, was the unglamorous but essential task of managing the vast territories that Persian power controlled. That Xerxes was assassinated suggests that there were internal political problems, that factions within the court competed for power, that the succession arrangements were contested or unclear, that the stability that empire required was fragile enough that ambitious officials could imagine overthrowing the established order and seizing power for themselves. But the assassination also suggests that the empire's institutions were strong enough to survive the crisis, that legitimate succession could be re-established despite the conspiracy, that Artaxerxes could claim the throne and execute the traitors and restore order without the empire fragmenting, without provinces rebelling, without the vast structure collapsing into chaos. The survival suggests that what Xerxes built or maintained was substantial enough to endure his violent death, was not entirely dependent on individual king's person, was system that could function despite the removal of its head because the body was healthy enough to regenerate leadership and continue operating. We contemplate what it means that Xerxes, who commanded millions, died helpless before a single assassin. That power cannot protect against intimacy's betrayals, that authority cannot prevent death, that empire cannot save the emperor from mortality. The tragedy is universal, reminds us that all power is temporary, that all authority is conditional, that all humans are vulnerable regardless of their status, that death comes for emperors as surely as it comes for slaves, that the mighty fall as suddenly as the weak, that invulnerability is always illusion. The palace shadows that hid Artabanus also hide deeper truths about power's nature, about how it functions and how it fails, about the gap between appearance and reality, about the distance between how kings present themselves and what they actually are, about the vulnerability that power creates even as it promises security, about how isolation at the top makes rulers dependent on others' loyalty and therefore vulnerable to others' betrayal. About how trust is necessary for governance, but how every act of trust is act of faith that might be betrayed. We close with image of the empty bedchamber, with the blood-stained sheets, with the silence after the violence, with the moment when the great king became corpse, when absolute power became absolute helplessness, when the person who ruled the world could not prevent his own murder, when empires might prove insufficient to save the emperor's life. The death in the palace shadows. The assassination that came through trust, the knife that ended Xerxes's reign and life and dreams, the mortality that no power can overcome, the vulnerability that no authority can eliminate, the death that comes for all regardless of their greatness, that reduces emperors to dust as surely as it reduces beggars to dust, that makes all human achievement temporary, makes all power transient, makes all empire mortal. A Persepolis stands in ruins, now columns broken, some standing, some fallen, staircases weathered by 23 centuries of wind and rain and sun, reliefs eroded but still legible, still showing the processions of tribute-bearers and the great king receiving delegations, still testifying to the empire that was and the vision that shaped it. The palace that Alexander burned in 330 BCE, whether in drunken rage or calculated destruction, sources disagree, stands as monument to both achievement and impermanence, to what humans can build and to what time and conquest inevitably destroy. The ruins tell of empire that was, of vision that shaped the world, of attempt at universal sovereignty that failed but that left traces, that influenced how later empires would understand themselves, that contributed to evolving ideas about governance and tolerance and the possibility of uniting diverse peoples under single authority without forcing uniformity upon them. The Achaemenid Empire that Cyrus founded, that Darius expanded, that Xerxes maintained and tried to extend this empire lasted 2 centuries. From roughly 550 BCE when Cyrus conquered Media until 330 BCE when Alexander defeated Darius III and the dynasty ended. 2 centuries is not long by some measures, is shorter than many dynasties, is brief compared to Egyptian pharaonic tradition or Chinese imperial continuity. But 2 centuries is longer than most empires manage, is substantial achievement for political structure that governed territories so vast and populations so diverse that holding them together seemed impossible, yet was accomplished through administrative genius and military power and ideological vision, that made subjects see Persian rule as legitimate, or at least as preferable to the alternatives of constant warfare or domination, by less tolerant conquerors. The empire fell to Alexander, to Macedonian conquest that replaced Persian Universal Empire with Greek Universal Empire. That changed the culture but maintained the structure. That preserved the administrative systems and the satrapy divisions and the infrastructure while imposing new ruling class and new official culture. The transition was less revolutionary than it might seem. The same territories continued to be governed. The same administrative systems continued to function. The same populations continued to live under imperial rule that demanded taxes and military service while allowing considerable local autonomy. What changed was the dynasty and the culture of the elite. What changed was that Greek replaced Persian as the prestige language, and Greek culture became the model that local elites aspired to. What changed was the identity of the empire while much of its substance persisted. But the Persian influence endured even through the cultural transformation that Alexander's conquest initiated. The Seleucid Empire that succeeded Alexander in the eastern territories maintained Persian administrative structures, governed through satraps, collected taxes using Persian methods, maintained roads and communication systems that Persians had built. The Parthian Empire that succeeded the Seleucids presented itself as successor to Achaemenid traditions, claimed to restore authentic Persian heritage against Greek contamination, created Iranian revival that would culminate in the Sasanian Empire's more thorough attempt to recreate Achaemenid glory. The Sasanians, who ruled Persia from 224 to 651 CE, saw themselves as heirs to the Achaemenids. Carved rock reliefs at Nakhsh Rostam near Persepolis showing Sasanian kings receiving investiture from Ahura Mazda, just as Achaemenid inscriptions had shown, revived Zoroastrianism as state religion, attempted to purify it from corruptions that centuries of Greek and Parthian rule had supposedly introduced. A created empire that in many ways paralleled Rome and that competed with Rome for dominance of the Near East, that preserved Persian cultural identity through 4 centuries until Islamic conquest brought Iranian plateau under Arab rule and eventually under Islamic cultural influence. But even Islamic conquest did not entirely erase Persian identity. The Persians who converted to Islam maintained linguistic and cultural distinctiveness, translated Persian administrative skills and cultural traditions into Islamic context, became essential to Abbasid Caliphate's governance, created Persian Islamic culture that preserved pre-Islamic heritage in transformed form, maintained connection to Achaemenid and Sasanian past that gave modern Iran sense of ancient heritage predating Islam and surviving Islamic conquest. The memory of Persian greatness shaped Iranian identity across 14 centuries of Islamic rule, created cultural continuity despite political discontinuity, gave Iranians sense of being heirs to civilization more ancient and more sophisticated than the Arab conquerors, gave basis for cultural pride that complicated the power dynamics of Islamic empire where Arabs initially dominated, but where Persians eventually became culturally influential despite political subordination. We stand among the ruins at sunset, watching light paint the broken columns gold, watching shadows lengthen across the stone reliefs that show tribute-bearers ascending stairs that lead to nowhere, to halls that no longer exist, to throne rooms where no king sits, to empire that exists now only in archaeology and memory, and the consciousness of continuity that Iranians maintain across millennia of transformation. The ruins are not simply debris, not merely the remnants of destruction, but are testimony to what humans can build, to what they can imagine, to what they can temporarily achieve before time and change and conquest reduce even the greatest works to fragments. But fragments can be eloquent. The broken columns testify to the columns that once stood complete, that supported roofs that sheltered the ceremonies where empire renewed itself annually, that created spaces where all the world's peoples met under Persian sovereignty. The weathered reliefs preserve enough detail to show what they depicted: the processions of tribute-bearers, each group distinctive, each bringing gifts characteristic of their lands, each representing peoples who had submitted to Persian authority but who maintained their identities, who contributed their uniqueness to the empire that contained them. The ruins remember what they were and what they meant and what they represented. Remember the vision of universal empire that would bring peace through superior power, that would protect diversity while requiring unity, that would allow all peoples to flourish within framework of order that prevented the chaos of constant warfare. Remember the great kings who sat on thrones in the Apadana, receiving delegations, dispensing justice, embodying the authority that held the empire together. Remember the ceremonies, the New Year festivals when representatives from 40 nations gathered to renew their loyalty and present their tribute and participate in rituals that proclaimed cosmic and political order were aligned, that the great king's rule was Ahura Mazda's will made manifest. Xerxes is gone, buried somewhere we no longer know, his tomb lost or destroyed, his body dust scattered by winds that blow across the Iranian plateau where his empire ruled. The empire is gone, fragmented by Alexander and never fully reconstituted despite later attempts, transformed into Hellenistic kingdoms and Parthian Empire and Sasanian Empire and Islamic Caliphate, and eventually into modern nation-states that divide territories that Xerxes governed as unified whole. The vision of universal peace under Persian rule is gone, proven unsustainable, revealed as dream that could not survive the dreamer's death, that could not overcome the forces of cultural difference and political ambition, and the desire for autonomy that makes peoples resist domination even when domination offers benefits. But the ruins remain, the inscriptions remain, the memory remains not complete, not perfect, not uncorrupted by time and by the needs of later ages to remember the past in ways that serve present purposes. But present nonetheless, available to those willing to sit among broken stones and listen to what they still say, to read what they still proclaim, to feel the weight of what was attempted here even when we acknowledge that the attempt failed, that the empire fell, that the vision could not be realized. The ruins invite questions. What can we learn from Xerxes's empire? What does Persian tolerance teach about governance? What does the empire's fall teach about power's limits? What does the vision of universal peace teach about human aspirations and their tragic incompatibility with human nature? The questions have no simple answers, admit multiple interpretations, allow different lessons to be drawn depending on what values we bring to the inquiry and what we want the past to teach us. But perhaps the most important lesson is humility, recognition that all human achievements are temporary, that all empires eventually fall, that all visions eventually fail or transform beyond recognition, that what seems permanent proves transient, that what seems eternal proves mortal. The lesson is not despair but is realism, is acknowledgement that limits exist, that we cannot build forever, that our greatest works will eventually become ruins that puzzle distant descendants who cannot fully understand what we were trying to achieve or why we thought it mattered. Yet the lesson is also encouragement. If Xerxes could build Persepolis, could create empire that governed 4% of the world's population, could maintain that empire for 2 centuries, then perhaps we too can build, can achieve, can create works that outlast us even if they don't last forever, can leave testimony that even when fragmented and eroded still speaks across centuries and tells those who come after what we valued, what we attempted, what we briefly accomplished before time took it away. Night falls over Persepolis, the ruins darken, the columns stand in starlight as they have stood for 23 centuries, as they will stand for centuries more unless earthquake topples them or human vandalism destroys them or simply erosion reduces them finally to rubble. And somewhere in the silence, Xerxes dreams still not the man, not the person who died in his bed murdered by his own guard, but the idea, the vision, the attempt at universal empire that he inherited and maintained and tried to extend. The dream failed. He failed at Salamis, where the sea swallowed the fleet, failed at Plataea, where the army was destroyed, failed in the palace shadows where the great king was murdered, failed across the 2 centuries when the empire gradually weakened and eventually fell to Alexander's conquest. But the dream persists in the ruins, persists in the memory, persists in the questions it raises about whether universal peace is possible, whether diverse peoples can be unified justly, whether empire can be organized to benefit subjects as well as rulers, whether human society can transcend tribal identity and local loyalty, and the warfare that constant competition produces. The questions remain urgent, remain unanswered, remain calling us to imagine better, to attempt what seems impossible, to build knowing that what we build will eventually fall, but building nonetheless because the alternative is to accept that chaos is inevitable, that conflict is permanent, that humans cannot organize themselves beyond small groups, cannot cooperate beyond narrow circles, cannot create peace that extends beyond temporary exhaustion between wars. Xerxes attempted universal peace through universal empire, attempted to unify the world through conquest and governance and the imposition of order from above. The attempt failed. But the dream endures not the specific vision of Persian rule, not the particular structures that Xerxes built, but the hope that humanity might find ways to live together peacefully, might create institutions that transcend parochial identities, might build civilization that encompasses diversity without erasing it, that maintains order without tyranny, that achieves peace without empire's compulsion. The ruins stand. The columns rise toward stars. The empire sleeps but does not die. And Xerxes rests, but his questions remain. The palace is broken, but the dream persists. And we who stand among the ruins 23 centuries after the great king died are still wrestling with the same problems, still seeking the same peace, still dreaming the dream that Xerxes dreamed and that humanity has always dreamed, the dream of a world unified, of peoples at peace, of empire that protects rather than oppresses, of order that enables rather than constrains, of governance that serves rather than dominates. The dream, the ruins, the eternal questions. The empire that sleeps where Persepolis stands, Xerxes the Great king, the invader of Greece, the builder of wonders, the victim of assassination, the dreamer of universal peace, forever remembered, forever contested. A forever teaching through his achievements and his failures, through what he built and what he destroyed, through the empire that rose and fell and left ruins, testifying to human capability and human limitation, to what we can achieve when we try, and to the inevitable dissolution that time brings to all achievement, to all power, to all empire, to all dreams however grand. Sleep now. The journey through Xerxes's world is complete. The great king has spoken through his monuments and his defeats, through his vision and its failure, through the ruins that remain and the questions they raise. Rest in knowledge that empires rise and fall, that power is temporary, that what seems eternal proves mortal, but that human aspiration persists, that we continue building despite knowing our works will eventually fall, that we continue dreaming despite knowing our dreams will eventually fail, that we continue seeking peace despite knowing that peace is always precarious, always threatened, always requiring renewal, always calling us to try again when previous attempts have failed. Good night. Sleep well. And wake remembering Xerxes not as villain or hero, but as human facing impossible challenges, as king trying to maintain impossible empire, as person whose choices shaped history and whose history shapes how we understand power and empire and the eternal human quest for peace and order and meaning. The king who burned the sea, the emperor of endless horizons. The dreamer whose dream failed but whose ruins testify still to the grandeur of the attempt, to the vision that shaped an empire, to the questions that remain urgent across 25 centuries of humans striving toward goals that always elude us yet that we cannot stop pursuing because to stop pursuing them would be to accept defeat, to abandon hope, to acknowledge that humanity cannot transcend its limitations and build the peace we have always desired but have never achieved. The ruins. The dream. The eternal questions. Good night.